Chapter 1. My Early Childhood. To begin at the beginning, I was born on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. My mother's nurse believed that I was going to be unlucky because midnight was unlucky. I was born at Blunderstone in Suffolk, England, 6 months after my father died. There was only my mother and me in our family. Well, there was an aunt of my father's called Betsy Trotwood. She was very unhappy in her marriage, and her husband left her and went to India, so she lived all alone by the sea. However, I never saw her while I was growing up. Now, on that Friday night when I was born, my mother was sitting by the fire, feeling very sick and sad. Suddenly, she saw a strange woman coming up the garden path. Mother was immediately frightened of this woman, who stood so straight and tall. This woman walked quickly to the window and looked inside. It was Betsy Trotwood. My mother got up and stood behind a chair as Miss Betsy came in.
"You must be Mrs. Copperfield,"
said the aunt.
"Yes,"
said my mother.
"I have come to see your baby girl,"
said Miss Betsy.
"Ask your servant to come in." "It might not be a girl,"
said my mother.
"Nonsense,"
said Miss Betsy.
"Peggotty?"
called my mother. Bigotti was our servant. She looked after us. She came to my mother right away.
"Get the doctor,"
said Miss Betsy to Bigotti.
"Mrs. Copperfield needs help."
Soon afterwards, our doctor arrived. He was a kind old man and was surprised to see Miss Betsy there. He took Mother upstairs, and my aunt sat downstairs. My aunt waited. After an hour or two, the doctor came back down to see her. "It's going slowly. Mrs. Copperfield is not very strong." He went back upstairs, and again Miss Betsy waited for a girl. At midnight he came downstairs and said, "Mrs. Copperfield is safe and well. She has a beautiful baby boy." At this my aunt stood up and hit him with her bonnet. She didn't say a word and left the house. She never came back, just like the bad fairy. While I was a young child, I lived with the two people I loved most, my mother and our servant, Bigotti. We lived in a beautiful old house with a large garden, and Bigotti looked after us. She cooked and cleaned and read me stories. I loved her dark kitchen. She worked very hard, and we lived a wonderful life. One night I was sitting with her while she was reading a children's book to me. "Are you married, Bigotti?"
"Goodness, no,"
said Bigotti.
"Don't you want a husband? You're very pretty."
"Goodness, no, Davy. I've never had a husband, and I don't want one. What would your mother do without me?"
Then she took me up to bed. The next day my mother came home with a strange man. He was tall and dark. Mother said,
"This is Mr. Murdstone, Davy. Shake hands."
I didn't like the man. He didn't smile, and he said, "You shouldn't kiss David so much, Mrs. Copperfield." Then to me he said, "Let's be best friends, David. Shake hands." I gave him my left hand. "That's the wrong hand," laughed Mr. Murdstone. Later I found Mother and Bigotti crying. Bigotti was saying,
"Mr. Copperfield wouldn't like this one, miss."
I didn't understand. A few days later, Bigotti asked me if I wanted to go to Yarmouth to see her brother.
"Oh, yes, please, Bigotti,"
I replied. So Bigotti and I set off the next day for her brother's place in Yarmouth. The horse was slow, so the journey felt very long. Then Bigotti fell asleep, but she brought lots of food, so our trip was still exciting. Finally, we arrived at the beach.
"Look,"
she said.
"There's our house, Master Davy."
I looked, but all I could see was an upside-down boat with a chimney. It was their house. We went inside, and it was beautifully clean. I met Mr. Ham Bigotti, Bigotti's brother, a little boy called Ham, and a little girl called Emily, whom I thought was very beautiful.
"Is this your daughter, Mr. Bigotti?"
I asked.
"No, she's my niece, And that boy, Ham, is my nephew, my brother's son. I have no children.
So where are their fathers?
Mr. Peggotty looked serious and said, "Drowned." I felt sad, and Peggotty said I should get to bed. We stayed at the boathouse for 2 weeks. During that time, I played with Emily a lot. We went down to the beach, and I felt close to her. She had no father, just like me. There was one other person in the boathouse, a Mrs. Gummidge. She was old and often said,
"Oh, I'm all alone, and no one cares for me."
I kept out of her way. After 2 weeks, Peggotty and I said goodbye to Peggotty's family. I was glad to be home, but was upset when Mother didn't come out to meet me.
Oh, Peggotty, is she dead?
No, no, Master Davy. You should know that you have a new father.
My heart felt cold. We went inside. Mother and Mr. Murdstone were sitting in the parlour. Mother got up to greet me, but she seemed timid. "Now, Clara, my dear, don't fuss over the boy," said Mr. Murdstone. "Davy, you have a new bedroom. Go there." I went upstairs and cried myself to sleep. In the morning, Mother came to see me and kissed me, but right after came Mr. Murdstone. "Now, Clara, leave him alone. Go away and I will talk to the boy." Mother left. "David, if I want to train a bad dog, what do I do?"
I don't know,
I said. "I hit him. Now wash your face and be a good boy." I thought things were bad, but they got worse. The next day, Mr. Murdstone's sister arrived. She was just like him, tall and dark and hard. She took the keys to the house from my mother. Mother tried to fight her, but she was too weak. Every night the Murdstones watched me as my mother asked me to recite a book from memory. I tried to remember. Before I went into the parlour, I knew everything perfectly, but once I started to speak, I said the wrong words. Mr. Murdstone looked at me and said to my mother, "Clara, make him do it again." I tried again, but made more mistakes. Miss Murdstone tapped her foot. They looked at me angrily.
"Try again, Davy,"
said my mother. "Don't help him," said Mr. Murdstone. "He's just lazy."
Please, sir, I'm not,
I said. Every night it was the same. Finally, Mr. Murdstone brought in a whip. I was frightened. I looked at Mother, and she was frightened for me. "Now, Davy, recite your book." I couldn't. I saw the whip in Mr. Murdstone's hand. "Well, Clara, I see I'll have to teach him a lesson." He moved toward me and caught me. His arm went around my small body. Immediately, I bit him. It was so sudden, Mr. Murdstone carried me to my room and threw me on the bed. I lay there crying and crying. He left me alone. 5 days later, I went away from Mother, away from Peggotty, and away from my lovely home. I was on my way to boarding school. Chapter 2. School Days. I got into the carriage and started to cry. The old coachman, whose name was Barkis, told me to dry my tears. He asked me about Peggotty and whether she was a good cook. I said that she was, and he said, "Tell her that Barkis is willing." We stopped at a coach house, and I went into the dining room. I had 3 shillings with me and asked for some food. The waiter served me, but he helped me eat all my food. I was still hungry, but I didn't say anything. I asked him for some paper, which he brought. "Paper costs money," he said, so I gave him a shilling. I wrote to Peggotty and told her that Barkis was willing. Then I got back on the coach to London. It took a long time, but finally the coach stopped and I got out. Mr. Mell, a teacher from the school, was waiting for me. He was a thin, sad man. He and I walked to the school. We stopped on the way for breakfast at an old woman's house. Mr. Mell played the flute, but it was a very sad song. We got to the school, but there was no one there.
It's holidays. Only really bad boys stay at the school when it's holidays.
explained Mr. Mell. We went into the dormitory. I saw a sign that said, "Take care of him, he bites." I looked around. Where was the dangerous boy, or perhaps a dog? No one else was around. I looked at Mr. Mell. He shook his head.
"The sign is for you, David. You must wear it."
I put it on. I was 8 years old and felt so alone. After about a month of this, the principal and all the boys came back to Salem House. The principal's name was Mr. Creakle, and he was a horrible man. He asked for me as soon as he came home. A man with a wooden leg took me into his part of the school, which was a lot better than where the rest of us lived. With my sign around my neck, I looked at Mr. Creakle and his wife. "So," he said, "you bite, do you? Well, let's see if you can bite this." He spoke very quietly, and the man with the wooden leg repeated his words after him. He took me by the ear and pinched it hard. "You may go. Take him away," said Mr. Creakle. I asked Mr. Creakle if I could take the sign off from around my neck. He jumped out of his chair and chased me out of the room. I ran to the dormitory and lay shaking for hours. The first boy to come back the next day was a student named Traddles. He told me that Mr. Sharp, another teacher, wore a wig. Traddles became a great friend. He introduced me to all the other boys. Although there were a few who danced around me like I was a wild dog, most of the boys felt sorry for me and my sign. Then I met Steerforth, one of the oldest boys in the school. He asked me if I had any money, and I told him I had 7 shillings from Bugatti. He took the money and bought wine and cakes and biscuits, and we all sat in the dormitory eating and drinking all night long. It was the best time I had had since arriving at the school.
"Good night, Copperfield,"
said Steerforth when we finally went to sleep.
"I'll take care of you."
Mr. Creakle, the principal, and Mr. Tungay, the head teacher, came in every morning. My teacher was Mr. Tungay. Every morning they came in and Mr. Creakle would say very quietly, "Cut that boy, Mr. Tungay." And Mr. Tungay would hit the poor boy with a cane. Mr. Tungay gave the cane to boys for being quiet or for saying something. He gave the cane to boys who looked at Mr. Creakle and boys who didn't. It was a miserable life, but Mr. Tungay seemed to enjoy himself. About this time, Steerforth asked me to tell him the stories from the storybooks I had read when I was at home with Mother. So every night I tried to remember the stories as well as I could and stayed up late telling them to Steerforth. I was often very sleepy. Mr. Mell was the only likable teacher. He quietly helped me to learn, and I liked him a lot. Unfortunately, Steerforth did not like him. He did everything to make his life miserable. One day, Mr. Creakle and Mr. Tungay had business in town and left Mr. Mell to look after the students. The children started to shout and play at their desks, and Mr. Mell could do nothing.
"Silence!"
cried Mr. Mell.
"Silence yourself,"
said Steerforth.
"You should not be rude to a gentleman,"
said Mr. Mell.
"Where's the gentleman?"
asked Steerforth. The students were silent. It looked as if Steerforth was going to hit Mr. Mell, but suddenly Mr. Creakle and Mr. Tungay came back. They wanted to know what was going on.
"Mr. Mell is not a gentleman, Mr. Creakle,"
said Steerforth.
"He has a mother in the poorhouse."
I felt awful. I had told Steerforth about our visit to Mr. Mell's relative, whom I thought was his mother. Now Steerforth was using it against him. "Then Steerforth is right," said Mr. Creakle. "If your mother is in the poorhouse, you cannot work here any longer."
"Then I shall go now,"
said Mr. Mell, and he looked down kindly at me.
"I shall not stay where I am not wanted."
Afterwards I was sad, but I had visitors and forgot about Mr. Mell. It was Ham and Mr. Bugatti. I introduced them to Steerforth, who was very polite and easy to talk to. They liked him immediately. The holidays soon arrived, and I was getting ready to go back to see my dear mother and Bugatti. I got into the coach and Mr. Barkis was waiting for me. "Did you send that message to Bugatti?" he asked.
Yes, Mr. Barkis. I said, Barkis is willing.
"There wasn't an answer," he replied. "When a man says he's willing, he expects an answer."
I'll ask her as soon as I see her,
I promised. As soon as I got off the coach, I went inside our house and ran up to see my mother. Mother had a little baby with her.
This is your baby brother, Davy,
she said. I was very happy. I held the little baby in my arms and felt at home. Mr. and Miss Murdstone were out. Bugatti came in.
Mr. Barkis says he wants an answer, Bugatti.
Bugatti laughed and threw her apron over her head.
He wants to marry me, but I'll not leave you, Davy, nor you, Mrs. Copperfield.
The three of us read books and talked until the Murdstones came home. Then I quickly went upstairs to bed.
If only there were no Murdstones,
I thought. The following days were awful. One day I was sitting in the parlor, holding the baby, when Miss Murdstone gasped.
"Clara, you mustn't let the boy hold the baby. Put the baby down this minute."
I was so frightened I almost dropped the poor thing. I started staying in the kitchen with Bugatti or going outside, but Mr. Murdstone soon stopped that. "You must always stay within my sight," said Mr. Murdstone. "And you, Clara, must not let him talk to your servant." After that I was stuck inside with the Murdstones. I had nothing to do, and I couldn't move. I just sat and sat for hours and hours. When the holidays ended, I was sorry to see the last of my mother, but I was happy to be leaving that unhappy home. She stood outside our house with the baby in her arms, waving to me. Chapter 3. The End of My School Days. I will never forget my birthday at Salem House. Mr. Creakle sent for me and told me my mother was dead. His wife, Mrs. Creakle, let me stay in their parlor all afternoon. I felt empty and sad. When I went to bed, Traddles, my friend, lent me his pillow. I left Salem House the next day to go home. A man in black came to collect me from the coach. He introduced himself as Mr. Omer and took me to his house. It had a sign up outside, Omer Tailors and Funerals. I went inside where his 3 daughters sat sewing. They talked and sewed, but I just sat there thinking quietly. "I remember your father," said Mr. Omer. "We buried him near your house." Mr. Omer and I talked of father for a while, and then he told me that my baby brother had died a few days before mother. Everyone left me for a while. Mr. Omer and his daughters had something to eat and invited me to join them, but I couldn't. Then Mr. Omer took me to my house, and I fell into Bugatti's arms. Dear Bugatti, she hadn't slept but stayed awake sitting beside mother in the bedroom. I saw Mr. Murdstone. He was sitting in an armchair crying. His sister wasn't crying, though. Bugatti took me to my room and told me about mother being sick.
She knew she was going, Master Davy. She wanted her baby to be buried with her. And she wanted me to tell you that she blessed you 1,000 times.
I went into the parlor and thought about my mother. I forgot about the frightened woman of the past year and could only remember my mother as a pretty young thing who danced with me in the parlor when I was a little boy. The first thing Mr. Murdstone did was to tell Bugatti to leave. She then asked the Murdstones if I could go with her for a short while to Yarmouth to stay with Mr. Bugatti and Ham. Mr. Murdstone agreed. We traveled to Yarmouth with Mr. Barkis. He asked Bugatti to marry him again, and she spoke to me.
Will you be happy if I marry, Davy?
Oh, yes, Bugatti,
I said.
Then Mr. Barkis can bring you to visit me.
She said I had good sense and told Mr. Barkis she would. I was very happy at Yarmouth, especially with Emily. She had grown so beautiful, but she wouldn't let me kiss her. She just laughed and ran away. Mr. Peggotty and Ham talked of Steerforth, and I told them what a wonderful man he was. A few weeks later, Miss Peggotty married Mr. Barkis, and they moved into a little cottage of Barkis's. Finally came the day I had to return to the Murdstones. I was very sad to leave Yarmouth and go back where I wasn't wanted. Peggotty said she would visit me every week, and she did. I did nothing during the week. There was nothing to do. I had no lessons. I had no friends. Mr. Murdstone just looked angrily at me every time he saw me, and Miss Murdstone told me to get out of the way. One day a friend of Mr. Murdstone's came to stay. His name was Mr. Queenian, and he had a bottle factory in London and offered me a job. "I'm sending you to do something useful," said Mr. Murdstone. The next day, neither sad nor happy, I left my little home on my way to the big world outside. I am not easily surprised nowadays, but it made me think about how I was sent away from school at the age of 10 to work. I started my work at the factory of Murdstone and Grinby. I worked with 3 other boys cleaning wine bottles from 8 in the morning to 8 at night, with rats and dirt all around me. On that first day, I met a man called Mr. Micawber. He became my landlord. Mr. Murdstone was paying him my rent. Mr. Micawber was a large, well-dressed gentleman. He collected me from work and took me through the back streets to his house. He introduced me to his wife and their 4 children, twins who were still nursing, a 4-year-old boy, and a 3-year-old girl. They were very poor and had many creditors. The creditors used to come knocking on the door very early, and they shouted at Mr. Micawber to come out. He never did. He used to say, "If you earn 20 shillings a year and spend 19, you will be happy. If you earn 20 shillings a year and spend 21, you will be unhappy." But he never followed these words. One day the creditors took all their furniture and put the Micawbers in debtors' prison. I liked the Micawbers a lot. Although they were poor and had money worries, they often laughed and joked. I went to visit them in prison often. Apart from my friendship with them, my life was miserable. After the Micawbers got out of prison, they were off to Plymouth, where Mr. Micawber believed something would turn up. I was very sorry to see them go. Mrs. Micawber kissed me like her own child, and Mr. Micawber told me again about the 20 shillings. Although they were off on an adventure, they seemed sadder than when their creditors were after them. Mr. Micawber promised to help me at any time in the future, if he could. Once they had gone, I had no friends in London and could not stay. I decided to run away from the factory and go and find my Aunt Betsy on the coast. I wrote to Peggotty to ask where she lived, and also to ask Peggotty for money. She sent me half a guinea and told me she thought Betsy Trotwood lived in Dover. That Saturday night, I said goodbye to the boys at the factory and packed my box to take to the Dover coach. It was too heavy for me to carry, so I asked a tall man on the street if he would carry my box for 6 pence. He agreed and followed me up to my room. We carried the box downstairs and put it on his cart. When he saw my half-guinea, he took it quickly from my mouth and shouted, "What? Shall I call the police? Are you stealing from your landlord?" And with that, he jumped on his cart and drove down the street with my money, my box, and my trip to Dover. Chapter 4. At Dover. I stood in the London streets watching the long-legged man disappear with my box and money, but I knew I had to make it to Dover. I walked 23 miles that day and sold my vest on the way to a shopkeeper for 9 pence. I lied down in a field and fell asleep right away. The next day, I stopped at another shop and met a mad old man who took my jacket but wouldn't give me the money for it. I stayed outside his shop all day. Finally, he paid me. My journey continued for another 4 nights. One day, a tinker and his wife came up to me. The tinker stole my scarf, and his wife whispered the word, "Go," to me. I ran away as fast as I could, and looked back to see him beating her. Again I slept beside the roads and wanted food and a clean bed. Finally, I arrived at Dover. I went into a shop and asked for Betsy Trotwood. The customer there was Aunt Betsy's maid. She took me to her, and I stood before her in her garden. I looked dreadful. I told my aunt I was her nephew, and she brought me indoors.
Dick! Mr. Dick!
She called. A large old gentleman came in.
Here is my nephew, David Copperfield, Mr. Dick. What shall we do with him?
Do with him? Why, bathe him, of course. So my aunt and her maid took me upstairs and bathed me, dressed me in Mr. Dick's clothes, and led me down to dinner. I was hungry. After dinner they put me in a beautiful bed. I lay down and was carried away in a world of dreams. I went down to breakfast the next day, very worried. My aunt was sitting at the table. She looked closely at me and said,
I have written to your stepfather, Mr. Murdstone.
Does he know where I am, Aunt? I asked.
Yes,
she said. Am I going back to him? I asked with tears in my eyes.
We'll see what he says,
she replied, and then she sent me up to see Mr. Dick. Mr. Dick was upstairs writing his book. I later learned that Mr. Dick was always writing his book, but King Charles I, King of England, who died in 1649, kept coming into his mind and stopping him. A few days later, Mr. and Miss Murdstone arrived. Unfortunately, they arrived by horse, and Miss Betsy Trotwood was furious. She shouted at them to get them off her land. Finally, they did. They walked to her cottage and came inside. Mr. Murdstone began, This boy ran away from his home and his work. He is thankless and rude. He never does what people say. He is the worst sort of boy.
Do you want him back?
Asked my aunt. I will have him back because it is my duty. If you want him, I shall leave him here and never take him back.
Do you want to go back, boy?
Asked my aunt. Oh, please, no, I cried. Mr. Murdstone is hateful. He hit me. Please let me stay here.
Well, Mr. Dick, what shall we do?
Do? Said Mr. Dick. Why, we should have some new clothes made for the boy.
You are absolutely right, Mr. Murdstone. I will take this boy off your hands and look after him. I can see you are cruel and mean, and I think the boy will do better with me. So began my new life with my aunt, Betsy Trotwood, and my new friend, Mr. Dick. My aunt changed my name. She called me Trotwood after herself. So I had a new life, new clothes, and a new name. I also had a new friend, Mr. Dick. He was always very happy and often took me out to fly kites. Of course, one day my aunt asked me about going to school. She had a school in mind, and we went the next day to visit Canterbury, the nearest large town, where her friend Mr. Wickfield lived. Mr. Wickfield was a rich lawyer and lived in a large house with his daughter, Agnes, who was about my age. We knocked on the door. My friend, Mr. Wickfield, will know where you can stay in town to be close to the school,
said my aunt. It was then that I met Uriah Heep. He answered the door. He was 15. He watched everything I did. I didn't like him, even when he shook my hand. I felt unclean and rubbed my fingers on my suit. Uriah led us into Mr. Wickfield's room. Mr. Wickfield had bad news. There was nowhere for me to stay. He agreed with my aunt that this school was the best, but the school had no more room for boarders. Then he invited me to stay with him and his daughter in his enormous home, and after a while, my aunt agreed. A servant took my bags up to a little room at the top of the house, and my aunt, Mr. Dick, and I had to say goodbye. Mr. Dick was sad, but my aunt just said,
Trotwood, make me proud of you. Never be mean in anything. Never be false. Never be cruel. Just remember that.
Then she left and never looked back. My new principal was a man called Dr. Strong, and all the boys loved him. He was quite old and had a lovely young wife called Annie. Mr. Wickfield took me to meet Dr. Strong, who was always working on his dictionary and carried little notes in his pockets. Dr. Strong's school was as different from Mr. Creakle's as good is from evil. I enjoyed my days, but especially my nights, because I studied hard, then had dinner with Agnes and her father. Her father drank rather a lot, but you could tell he loved his daughter more than anyone, and she him. The only person I did not like in this time of my life was Uriah Heep. He was always saying how humble he was and how much he liked Agnes. It made me feel a bit sick. Mrs. Strong had asked Dr. Strong, who had asked Mr. Wickfield, to find a place of work for her cousin, Jack Maldon. Mr. Wickfield found him some work in India, and Dr. and Mrs. Strong held a going-away party for Mr. Maldon soon after I arrived in Canterbury. The party was a happy affair with singing, lots of food, but Mrs. Strong fainted, and everybody crowded around her. We were very worried. Then she got up and said there was nothing wrong. We all left the party, but I had to go back to collect Agnes's purse. When I returned, I saw Mrs. Strong on the floor at her husband's feet. She was watching him read. She looked so sad, almost in pain. She asked him to let her stay. I never forgot her look or her words.
Chapter 5. At Canterbury.
Of course, I wrote to Bigotty about my new life, and she, in turn, wrote to me telling me that the Murdstones had sold our old house. I was sad, but Mr. Dick kept me happy. He came to visit every Wednesday and became great friends with Dr. Strong, whom he admired. Then one day, Mr. Dick told me about a stranger who was following my aunt around and who came to the door one day and, Mr. Dick was sure, to whom my aunt gave some money. I didn't really believe Mr. Dick, although I liked him. He often talked about King Charles I as if he were alive, even though the king had died in 1649. Meanwhile, at Mr. Wickfield's home, I saw a lot of Uriah Heep, who asked me to visit him and his mother at their house. I didn't really want to go, but Uriah made me feel I was being proud and I couldn't say no. Uriah and his mother were so happy that I visited them for tea. Mrs. Heep was the same as Uriah, saying she was very humble all the time. They found out everything about Mr. Wickfield and Agnes's life from me. I couldn't stop them, and I felt dirty afterwards. While I was feeling uncomfortable, we heard a cry through the open door. "David Copperfield!" It was Mr. Micawber. He came in and I introduced him to Uriah and Mrs. Heep. After a while, Mr. Micawber took me to see Mrs. Micawber. They were still poor and had a lot of debt, and they were always either very upset about their money worries or very happy when they forgot them completely. A few days later, I saw Mr. Micawber and Uriah walking along the street, and I was a little worried. What if Mr. Micawber was telling Uriah all about my factory life in London? I didn't like to tell him what to say, but I was glad to receive a letter from Mr. Micawber shortly afterwards telling me that the family had moved back to London. I have several distinct memories of the days from my childhood to youth. One moment I remember is in school. I am not the smallest boy in the school. I am as big as the other boys. Then I remember Miss Shepherd. Dear Miss Shepherd, she is a little girl with curly hair, and I dance with her at school dances. One day I meet her outside the dance hall, and she laughs at me. All is over. I love her no more. Suddenly, I see the butcher boy. He stops young boys and hits them. I decide to stop him. I fight him and get knocked down, but then I get up and hit him back. It doesn't last. He hits me to the ground, and the other boys carry me home. I look very bad with blood all over me, but as always, Agnes looks after me. Now Adams is no longer the head boy. In fact, I become the head boy, and I look down on a long line of younger boys. I look at Agnes, no longer the little girl she was when I first arrived at Mr. Wickfield's house. What else has happened to me? I am in love again, this time with Miss Larkins. She is much older than me, and she likes soldiers in the army. I see them in the street saying hello to her. I know Mr. Larkins, her father, and often bow to him, asking him how she is. One night I go to a ball, and she is there. She asks me to dance, and I feel wonderful. The next day I find out she is getting married, and I feel sad for a week or two, but then, like all young loves, it passes. At this time I am now 17. After I left school, my aunt, Mr. Dick, and I often spoke about what I would do in life. I didn't have any idea, and so my aunt asked me if I'd like to go on a holiday to visit Bugatti. I could go to London and spend a few days there on the way to Yarmouth. I was very happy to be going to see Ham and Mr. Bugatti, and I called on Agnes to say goodbye. "Whenever I get into trouble or fall in love, Agnes, I shall tell you," I said to her. Then she became serious and told me how worried she was about her father. I had noticed he drank a lot, and I knew he had a lot of work. Uriah Heep seemed to upset him too. We did not speak more of it, but went to visit Dr. Strong and his beautiful wife Annie. Mrs. Strong's cousin, Jack Maldon, was coming back from India, but Mrs. Strong herself seemed very quiet and did not look at anyone in the eyes. After the party, we said goodbye to Mrs. Strong and her husband. The next day, I rode off to London in a carriage. I thought I was very grown up, but the coachman asked me to give up my seat to an older man who was sitting in the back. I tried to act like I was older, but the coachman didn't believe me. We all got off at the Golden Cross Inn, and I booked a room for the night. They put me in a small room at the back. I unpacked and went off to the theatre to see Julius Caesar. I thought it was very good, and when I got back to the inn, I sat in the coffee room. Who should I see coming in but Steerforth? He greeted me and put his arms around me. Then he found out where my room was and complained to the owners of the inn. He made them move me to a better room. He told me that he was studying at Oxford and was just here in London to visit his mother. After many drinks together, we agreed to meet at breakfast. I went to bed and dreamed of Rome, friends, and morning coaches. When I woke up, it was raining and there was a thick fog around the inn. I went down and found Steerforth looking proud and handsome. We had breakfast together, and he asked about my plans. When he found I was on my way to Yarmouth, he invited me to come and stay with his mother and him for a few days. I agreed. We caught a carriage to his home in Highgate. It was an old home, and a middle-aged lady met us. She stood very tall and looked down on me. This was his mother, Mrs. Steerforth. We went into the dining room, where there was another much younger lady. She had sharp looks and was very thin. Her name was Miss Rosa Dartle. She wasn't married and was Mrs. Steerforth's companion. She had a large white scar on her lip. I talked easily to Mrs. Steerforth and her son, but I noticed Steerforth didn't like Miss Dartle. Mrs. Steerforth showed me a picture of Steerforth as a boy and a piece of his hair from when he was a baby. She loved him greatly and liked me because I was a good friend of her son's. When the ladies retired and we were alone, Steerforth told me that he had made the scar on Miss Dartle's face. When he was a boy, he had got angry with her and thrown a hammer at her face. It had cut her deeply. When I got to my bedroom late that night, I saw a picture of Miss Dartle without her scar upon the wall. I fell asleep wishing her picture wasn't watching me. Chapter 6. At Yarmouth and London. I stayed with Steerforth for a week, and his servant, Littimer, looked after me. I enjoyed being with Steerforth more than anyone in the world. He was very easy-going and likable. He got us horses, and we went riding. We boxed, and he taught me to fence. After a week, Steerforth and I left for Yarmouth and the Bugattis. We travelled into Yarmouth, and Steerforth checked into the inn and left me to meet Bugatti. Before I went to Bugatti's house, I went to visit the Omers, where I had last seen my mother. I walked in and spoke to Mr. Omer, who was much older, and he remembered me. He spoke of the Bugatti family and little Emily, who, he said, now worked for him as a seamstress. I saw her working in the back room, but she did not see me. She was as pretty as ever. I left and went to see Biggotti. She cried when she saw me and told me Mr. Bacchus was sick in bed. Steerforth joined us, and we had a merry time over dinner. Later, Steerforth and I went to Mr. Biggotti's boathouse on the sand, and we went inside. Everyone was sitting around the fire. They all welcomed me, and I introduced Steerforth. Little Emily was very shy and went into another room, and Mr. Biggotti told us that Ham was going to marry her. Steerforth said she must come back, and we sat talking about boats and fishing and ships. Steerforth was marvelous. He led the conversation and made everyone feel comfortable. Afterwards, on the walk, I told him what a great man he was to take pleasure in their humble joy. "He's a bit of an idiot for Emily, isn't he, David?" asked Steerforth. I was surprised at his cold words. "You don't mean that, Steerforth?" I asked. "I believe you are good, David. I wish we all were," was all he said. Steerforth and I stayed in Yarmouth for 2 weeks. We were often apart. Steerforth went sailing with Mr. Biggotti, and I stayed with Biggotti and went looking around the places of my childhood. One night I came back to Mr. Biggotti's house and found Steerforth looking very sad. He was sitting looking into the fire. He would not tell me what this sadness was about, but said that I was a much better person than he was. I told him he was as good as me, and he told me that he had bought a boat down there, and that Mr. Biggotti would look after it while he was away. I was amazed. He really did like the place. The boat was called the Stormy Petrel, but he was going to change the name to the Little Emily. We got up and left the house and walked to the inn. As we were walking, we saw Ham and Emily arm in arm. There was a strange shadow of a woman following them, but she soon faded. When we came to the inn, Littimer was there to wait on us. He told us that Miss Moucher was here to see Steerforth, who agreed to see her after dinner. Miss Moucher was a very strange woman. She was short and fat and laughed all the time. She told us stories of the important people in London and worked by doing the hair of rich people in the city. She was here to do her friend Steerforth's hair. She climbed up on the table behind him and told him he was a naughty man. I walked back to Mr. Bacchus's and Biggotti's to find Ham waiting outside. He said that Emily was inside with a poor woman whom Emily had once known. It was Martha, who used to work at Mr. Omer's with Emily. We went inside, and Martha was crying. She wanted Emily to help her get to London, to move away from Yarmouth, where everyone knew her. I understood that Martha felt badly about her life, but I never found out what Martha had done. Emily quietly gave her more than enough money to cover her travel costs. When Martha left, Emily cried on Ham's shoulder and said she was not good enough for Ham. I felt I didn't understand what was happening. The next day I received a letter from my aunt asking me if I would like to become a law clerk. I talked with Steerforth, and we decided it would suit me well. We left for London, and there I went to meet my aunt. My aunt did not like London. She did not like the crowds and felt sure every house would burn down in a fire. She had left Mr. Dick to look after her place. She was pleased when I said I would be happy to become a law clerk, but I asked her if it would be very expensive. She said it would cost £1,000. I felt it was a great deal of money and didn't want her to spend so much on me. But she said,
"Trot, I want you to be a good, sensible man, and I want you to have a good job. Let's go and see Mr. Spenlow of Spenlow and Jorkins to find you a place."
As we walked to their offices, I saw an old man following us. My aunt got frightened and told me to go in the carriage while she spoke to him. I remember Mr. Dick's words, and when my aunt came back, she had no money in her purse, just as Mr. Dick had said. She would not tell me who the man was. We went to Spenlow and Jorkins and met Mr. Spenlow. He was a large man in tight, neat clothes. He said that he would like to be generous and ask for less money to become a law clerk, but his partner, Mr. Jorkins, would not. At dinner that evening, my aunt saw an advertisement for some rooms that were available for rent. We went the next day, and I moved in as quickly as possible. Mrs. Krupp placed the advertisement and became my landlady. I felt happy and proud and old. It was wonderful to live on my own and do everything I wanted, but I was sometimes lonely. I called Steerforth at his home, but he was out, and I talked with his mother and Miss Dartle. Then the next day, Steerforth came to see me, and I showed him my place. I was very proud and invited him and his friends to have dinner with me later in the week. Mrs. Krupp was not very pleased by the idea. There were problems. She could only cook lamb, so I would have to buy the rest of the dishes from a restaurant, and she couldn't wait on the table for us. I'd have to get a housemaid for the night. I was worried about the dinner. However, Steerforth and his two friends, Markham and Granger, were very happy to eat with me, even though the maid kept breaking the plates and the food was not the best. We drank a lot of wine. In fact, I drank so much I became drunk. I remember trying to walk down the stairs after we decided to go out. I slipped a few times, and Steerforth helped me. We went to the theater, and I remember shouting at the actors, and suddenly, in front of me, was Agnes. She turned to me and quite sharply said to me,
"Please leave now, Trot. Your friends will take you. You're making too much noise."
My friends did take me home, but the next morning I felt awful. How rude I had been. How badly I had behaved. I wanted to go down to Mrs. Krupp and tell her what a bad boy I'd been. Chapter 7. I Fall in Love. I felt very sick the next day, but a letter from Agnes inviting me over that afternoon made me feel a little better. She was staying with the Waterbrooks. I felt very sorry about my actions the night before, but when I went to see Agnes, she was, as always, welcoming and forgiving. "Oh, you are my good angel," I said to Agnes.
"If I am your good angel, then Steerforth is your bad angel,"
replied Agnes. "Oh, no," I said. "You don't know him like I do. He's good and kind."
"I think you should watch him and not spend too much time with him,"
said Agnes.
"Now I have something important to tell you about Uriah Heep. He has become very important to my father. In fact, he is so powerful that my father has made him a partner."
I was horrified. Uriah a partner? That nasty little man who was always so humble. I was very angry, and I could not hold my feelings in when I met him at a party later in the day at the Waterbrooks. Uriah watched Agnes and me while we were talking. The only good thing about the party was that I met my old school friend Traddles there. After the party, I invited Uriah back to my place, and what he said there frightened me even more. He said he wanted to marry Agnes. I could not stand the idea of them marrying, and wanted to throw hot coffee over him. He stayed with me overnight, but I was very pleased to say goodbye to him. Days and weeks passed. I worked very hard at Spenlow in Jorkins, and then one day Mr. Spenlow invited me to stay at his house. Some of my colleagues were very interested. Mr. Spenlow had never invited them there. I went down to Mr. Spenlow's place with Mr. Spenlow. I listened to him talk about work and found myself very confused. However, a real surprise awaited me at Mr. Spenlow's house. Mr. Spenlow took me into his front room and introduced me to his daughter, Dora. I could not speak. I could not think properly. I was instantly in love with this beautiful person. Then who should I find in the room as well but Dora's companion, Miss Murdstone. She looked at me angrily and took Dora off into another room. I had to wait until dinner before I saw my angel again, and then I did not know what to say to her. She was very pretty and talked sweetly to her little dog, Jip. I'm afraid to say, Jip didn't like me. He showed his teeth and growled at me. Even the next day, Jip did not come near me, and I'm sure Dora didn't notice me at all, but Miss Murdstone did. She came up to me and said,
It would be better if we did not say anything about knowing each other. Let's start again.
I told her I thought she and her brother were very cruel to me and my mother, but I would not say anything to Mr. Spenlow about her. When I got back to London, I threw out all my clothes and bought new ones. I started wearing expensive clothes, and Mrs. Krupp noticed.
Because I am a mother, I can tell you're in love, Mr. Copperfield,
she said. I said that I wasn't, but she knew better than me. The next morning, I decided to go and look for Tommy Traddles. His address was in a cheap and dirty part of London. It made me think of the part of London in which I had spent with the Micawbers. In fact, when I got to Tommy's address, there was a milkman shouting at the door. "I want my money! I won't give you any more milk!" Yes, it was just like my days with the Micawbers. I went upstairs and met Traddles, who was happy to see me. He laughed over our school days, but I remembered a sadder time at school. Traddles explained that he was very poor, but training to be a lawyer. He also said he was engaged to a lovely girl in Devonshire. Of course, I told him about my lovely Dora and how I hoped to marry her one day. Then someone knocked on the door. It was Traddles' landlord, Mr. Micawber. I could not believe it. Mr. and Mrs. Micawber were very happy to see me again. "I'm sorry to say you find us at a difficult time," said Mr. Micawber. "I am selling corn, and it does not bring much money. Our children are well and growing, but I need to feed all of them, and none of Mrs. Micawber's family will help us." Mrs. Micawber invited me to dinner, but I thought it would take food from their mouths, so instead, I invited Traddles and the Micawbers to dinner at my place in a week's time. I asked Mrs. Krupp to cook fish and some meat for Traddles and the Micawbers, but she said no. She said she was not able to do so, but we soon agreed that she would if she didn't cook anything for me for the following 2 weeks. I prepared for the dinner, and my 3 guests arrived. I welcomed them to my home. Unfortunately, Mrs. Krupp did not do the beef very well. It was pink and almost raw. However, we all laughed over this. We cut the meat up, put it on forks, and cooked it in front of my fire. We were laughing and enjoying ourselves when there was a knock on my door. Who should be standing there but Littimer? He asked if Steerforth was with me. I said no. Then he went on to cook and serve us our meal. My 3 guests left me shortly afterwards. Mr. Micawber gave me a note to read later, and I sat drinking by the fire. Later that night, Steerforth did come to visit me. He had been in Yarmouth and came with a letter from Bigotty. It said that Mr. Barkis was sick and probably dying. I wanted to go to see her and asked Steerforth to come with me. He agreed. We said good night, and I read Mr. Micawber's letter. It was a sad one. He said that all was lost. He had borrowed money from Traddles, and the money was now gone. Poor Traddles. Chapter 8. Emily and Steerforth. I went to Mr. Spenlow the next morning to ask if I could have a few days off work, and he agreed. I went straight to Steerforth's home and met Mrs. Steerforth and Miss Dartle again. Miss Dartle watched me closely all the time. When Steerforth arrived, the 4 of us walked around their gardens, but Miss Dartle kept close to me and asked,
Please tell me, because I want to know. Is it with you that Steerforth spends all his time? I only want to know because I am ignorant.
No, not with me. I have only just seen him. He's been away. I don't know where.
Please,
said Miss Dartle.
Not a word of this to anyone.
I didn't know why it should be a secret, but I agreed. Later, Steerforth spent a lot of time with Miss Dartle and seemed to be trying to please her. When we heard Miss Dartle playing the harp in the music room, Steerforth said, Don't get up, my dear Rosa. Be kind and sing us a song. She sang the most beautiful song I had ever heard. Then Steerforth said, Come, Rosa, in the future we will love each other very much. Then she hit him and flew out of the room. I could not understand her, but Steerforth laughed and just said, She's very dangerous." Then it was night, and I had to say goodbye to Steerforth, because I was leaving early in the morning. I went straight down to Yarmouth and checked into the inn. Then I went into the village. There I met Mr. Oram, who was sitting smoking his pipe. I asked him how Mr. Barkis was, but he said, "I can't ask in my job. Everyone thinks I want more business." Then he spoke of Emily. He said that she seemed unwilling to marry. She was very quiet, and he thought perhaps this was because of Mr. Barkis. So I went on to Begotti's house and found Mr. Begotti, Emily, Ham, and Begotti. They were happy to see me, but not very excited about my arrival. I think death makes all other surprises less important. Ham wanted to take Emily home, but she wanted to stay with her uncle. Finally, they left, and I went upstairs with Begotti and Mr. Begotti to see Mr. Barkis. He was lying on his bed, holding a box of precious objects he had collected. He didn't seem to know me and looked very ill. Time and the world were slipping from him. "He's going out with the tide," said Mr. Begotti. "With the tide?" I asked. "People along the coast can't die except when the tide's going out, and they can't be born except when the tide's coming in." The three of us stood there watching Mr. Barkis for hours. Then Begotti said,
"Barkis, my dear."
and he stretched his arm out to me.
"Look,"
said Begotti.
"here's Master Davy."
Barkis leaned toward me and said,
"Barkis is willing."
And it being low water, he went out with the tide. I was helpful to Begotti in the days that followed Mr. Barkis's death. I looked for and found all his important papers in the box he had held on his deathbed. He left some money to Mr. Begotti, but most everything, and that was £3,000, to Begotti. We all wore black and went to the funeral. Not many of us were there, but we went back to Mr. Begotti's, a sad group. When we got there, well, I can hardly remember without putting down my pen. I simply don't want to write of it. Emily had not yet appeared. Just then, Ham came in. "Please come outside with me, Master Davy," he said, and I went out with him. I asked him where Emily was. "She's gone, Master Davy," he cried. "She's gone and left this letter." He showed me the letter which said,
When you read this, I shall be far away. I am very sorry to hurt you, Ham, but I love another, and have gone away with him. Don't look for me. Unhappily yours, Emily.
Mr. Begotti called us in and asked to see the letter. He was very upset, as we all were. Even Mrs. Gummidge felt sorry for Emily, and forgot her own sadness. "But who is it she has gone away with?" I asked Ham. "Well, sir, I've seen Littimer around, and Emily was in a carriage with a tall old gentleman. That could be Littimer." "No," I cried. "Not with Steerforth." It was strange to me, but I didn't hate Steerforth. I could never speak to him again and never see him again, but I didn't hate him. He had taken our Emily away. I went to see Ham and Mr. Begotti. Ham looked out to sea, and I knew he would kill Steerforth if he met him. Mr. Begotti just looked sadly down and said, "I know my duty. My duty is to find my little girl." He told Mrs. Gummidge, who was now so helpful, to keep a light in the window for Emily if she should come back, and he and I set off the next day for London. Of course, the first place to call was Steerforth's home to talk to Mrs. Steerforth and ask her about her son. I wrote a note to Mrs. Steerforth, and we went to see her. She was sitting in the front room with Miss Rosa Dartle standing behind her. Mrs. Steerforth looked majestic and did not smile.
"What do you want with me?"
She asked Mr. Begotti. "Please, ma'am," he said, "your son has taken our Emily away from her family. I would like to ask your son to marry her."
"I do not know where they are, but I know this. He will never marry the girl. She is too simple. too poor. He has been to school and knows many things. He is far too important to marry her."
"Then I will look for her until she comes back to us," said Mr. Peggotty simply, and we left. Miss Dartle ran out to us and said in a hateful way,
"I hope that girl dies, and I hope she dies horribly."
When we arrived at Mr. Peggotty's house, he packed his things and said, "I'm going to seek her far and wide, and if she comes back before I do, just say my last words were, 'My unchanged love is with my darling child, and I forgive her.'" Chapter 9. Happiness and Bad News. I spent all my days thinking of Dora. Everything was Dora. The sun, the moon, the night, the gardens, the streets, all made me think of Dora. Naturally, I told Peggotty, who, of course, thought that Dora was the lucky one to have me. I had to take Peggotty in to see Mr. Spenlow about Barkis's will, and while we were there, we met Mr. Murdstone. He was there to get a marriage license, as he was getting married again. I felt sorry for his bride. Peggotty was very rude to him. Mr. Spenlow told us later that Mr. Murdstone was marrying for money. Then Mr. Spenlow and I talked for a while, and he invited me down to his house again, this time to celebrate Dora's birthday. I could hardly stand. I was so full of happiness. I went shopping and bought some very tight boots, and wore a new tie, and I hired a new horse to ride down to Norwood. Dora was sitting with Miss Mills and Jip, and I gave her some flowers. We all went on a picnic with some other people. I just wanted to hold her hand. She had the prettiest hand. Later in the day, as we were riding back, Miss Mills said to me that Dora was coming to stay with her, and I could visit her there. Oh, what joy! I went down a few days later and met Dora, and we became engaged. I wrote to Agnes and told her of my engagement to Dora. I never spoke of Steerforth, but I'm sure she knew. Meanwhile, Peggotty had moved into my place, and Mrs. Krupp was angry about that. She didn't like Peggotty cooking for me and looking after me, and she stopped doing my washing. One day, Traddles arrived. He no longer lived with the Micawbers. They had changed their name and moved elsewhere. Some people were looking for them for money. Traddles, of course, had lost the money he had given to Mr. Micawber, and the debt collectors had taken his only furniture, a flower pot, and a little round table. He asked if Peggotty could go to the shop and buy them back. Peggotty was only too happy to do so. Traddles was very happy when Peggotty bought back his furniture, and we carried it home. But when we got there, we found my aunt in my room sitting on her suitcase, and Mrs. Krupp serving tea to her and Mr. Dick, who was standing behind a large kite.
"I am ruined, Trot,"
said my aunt.
"I have no money left. All I have in the world is my cottage, and I've put people in there to pay rent."
I was astonished. Of course, I let my aunt stay with me, and we found rooms for Mr. Dick. My aunt was worried about a fire breaking out, but that night she said to me,
"We must not let ourselves be down over this. We must have courage."
I took Mr. Dick to a furniture store to buy him a bed, and while we were there, I tried to find out what he understood of my aunt's troubles. He smiled and said that Betsy Trotwood was ruined. I explained that this was a bad thing, and then I was sorry for it because Mr. Dick became so sad. When we got back, I found my aunt had been talking to Peggotty, and now thought her a sensible woman, in spite of her silly name. I talked to my aunt of Dora, and how I now couldn't marry her because I had no money. My aunt said,
"Poor boy."
The next morning, I went straight to Spenlow and Jorkins to ask Mr. Spenlow if we could have back some of the £1,000 my aunt had paid for me to study as a law clerk. Mr. Spenlow said no, and I even saw Mr. Jorkins, and he said no. There was no way to get any money back. How would I ever marry Dora? I went back home feeling depressed, but I met Agnes at home. She, her father, and Uriah Heep were in town to visit my aunt, as they had heard of her trouble. Agnes told me that Uriah and his mother now lived with her and her father. It saddened me. My aunt explained that she had some money from her cottage,
and Mr. Dick had a small salary.
but she had put all her savings in a company that had gone bad. Agnes then said that Dr. Strong was looking for a secretary, and if I could find the time, I could earn some money doing that. I wrote to the doctor right away. Uriah and Mr. Wickfield arrived. My aunt disliked Uriah right away, telling him to stand up straight and stop acting like a snake. Uriah left soon afterwards, and Agnes, Mr. Wickfield, my aunt and I had a pleasant evening just like old times.
I woke up and was no longer sad about being poor.
I felt full of enthusiasm and wanted to work hard to win Dora. I walked everywhere very fast and believe this helped me to fight for Dora. First, I went to Dr. Strong's house, and he made me his secretary. He said he would pay me £70 a year to work every morning and every night at his house. I met the lovely Mrs. Strong again, and also her cousin, Jack Maldon, who came by to invite her to the opera. I didn't like Mr. Maldon, but Dr. Strong wanted his wife to go with Mr. Maldon to be with someone young. I was now getting up at 9 o'clock and getting home at 8 in the evening, but I didn't mind. I went to visit Traddles and found him hard at work. He gave me a letter from Mr. Micawber, which said that he had a new job and invited us to a dinner that night at his place before he left. When we met Mr. Micawber, he said that his job was in Canterbury with Uriah Heep. Oh, how my heart shook at that name, but I didn't say anything. We had a happy dinner, and Mrs. Micawber said that Mr. Micawber may be a judge or something like that in the future. Mr. Micawber stood at the table and raised his glass, saying, "I know I owe Traddles some money. I have added it up. It comes to £41, 10 shillings and 11½ pence. I therefore give him a note saying that I owe him that much." I think even Traddles thought it was real money until the next day. Chapter 10. A Death. I was working hard and walking fast everywhere, and my aunt had a battle with Mrs. Krupp downstairs, whom she terrified. But she was getting to like Bugatti, who left the following Saturday. Bugatti said she would give me money now that she was rich, but I refused. I had to tell Dora that I didn't have any money. I had been writing to her via Miss Mills, and was going to see her on Saturday evening at Miss Mills' house. I waited outside until Mr. Mills had left and raced up the stairs to see my darling. Jip was there and barked at me as if I were a thief, but Dora was happy to see me. I told her immediately, "Dora, I am your ruined David." She burst out crying. I tried to explain that I had 2 jobs now, and we should not be married if she couldn't marry a poor man.
But I hoped that together we could live on love and work hard.
Dora got upset. She turned away and cried again. I asked her if she could learn to do the housekeeping, and she screamed. She called for Miss Mills to come and told me to go away. I felt like a monster. How could I ask dear Dora to do anything for herself? She was too precious and sweet. Later she calmed down and played the guitar for us, but I knew that I would have to do all the hard work in our marriage, and little Dora was no more than a doll. I was trying to learn shorthand, but not doing a very good job of it. Traddles came over to help me by reading speeches from Parliament while I wrote them down. My aunt and Mr. Dick sat and listened. After about 6 weeks, Mr. Spenlow called me into his office. He did not look happy. He asked me to go with him to a coffee shop, and there in the corner was Miss Murdstone.
"Miss Murdstone,"
said Mr. Spenlow,
"please show Mr. Copperfield what you have in your bag."
She took out my letters to Dora, and I knew it was all over.
I found one of these in Jip's mouth. When I read it, I asked Dora, and she gave me these other letters.
"Mr. Copperfield, you have done a dark and secret thing. You will not see Dora again. You will forget her."
I went away very upset. How could I forget the dearest girl? And how awful of Miss Murdstone. The next day I went into the office and found everyone talking and not working.
"Mr. Spenlow is dead," said Tiffy. "He died last night while coming home on his own in a carriage."
My poor Dora. I wrote to her. She was going to stay with 2 aunts of hers. She was no longer rich. In fact, she was quite poor. Miss Mills continued to see her and reported back to me. How I wanted to help her and be with her, my angel and all alone in the world. I was so concerned about Dora that my aunt decided I should do something. So she sent me to Dover to see her cottage and make sure it was looked after. After I visited Dover, I went straight to Canterbury, where I had lived with Agnes and her father, and been to school. The city was very beautiful and calm, just like Agnes. When I called on her, she was sitting in front of the fire, writing. Of course, I told her all about Dora and her father's death. Now I asked her what should I do. Dora lived with her 2 aunts. How could I contact her? Agnes gave me good advice.
You should not do anything in secret any more. You should write to the dear ladies and ask to see Dora. Say you will be polite and do whatever they ask.
I knew Agnes would help me. We would have talked longer, but Mrs. Heep came in with her knitting. She sat and watched us like an eagle watches the little birds below. That evening was worse. After the ladies left us, Uriah wanted us to drink to Miss Agnes. He said she was the most delightful girl, and he would be proud to marry her. Mr. Wickfield stood up and tried to hit him. I held him back, and he started to cry.
"My Agnes marry that awful man? Never!"
The next day, as I was leaving, Uriah Heep came out to see me. "Don't worry, Master Copperfield. Mr. Wickfield has apologized, and I have apologized to him. It's all better. He'll get used to the idea." I drove away feeling depressed for my poor dear Agnes. I was very saddened by the happenings at the Wickfield house, and told my aunt about them. She too worried all night and couldn't sleep. I did as Agnes said, and wrote to the Mrs. Spenlow, asking if I could see Dora. It was very cold and snow was falling. I walked home and saw a man coming towards me. I recognized him. It was Mr. Peggotty. We hugged each other, and I think Mr. Peggotty even cried. We went straight to an inn to have a drink. As we walked in, I noticed a woman watching us. It was Martha Endell, the woman Emily had given money to. She stayed away from us, and Mr. Peggotty didn't see her. I asked Mr. Peggotty for any news. He had just arrived in London and was ready to go off to Germany to look for Emily. He had started in France and found kindness from all sorts of people along the way. Then he heard Emily and Steerforth were in Italy, so he went there. When he arrived, he heard they had gone to Switzerland. He travelled over the mountains, but when he got there, they'd gone. He then came back home to Yarmouth and found 2 letters from Emily with some money in them. They were very sad letters. She apologized for being so bad and asked for forgiveness. Now that Mr. Peggotty had these letters, he knew where she was, and he planned to go there the very next day. I said goodbye to Mr. Peggotty outside the inn and watched his footprints in the snow, wondering when I would see him again. Chapter 11. I Get Married. At last I had an answer from the 2 old ladies. They invited me to see them, together with a friend of mine, the following Sunday. Of course, I asked Traddles to come with me. We were ready on Sunday for the walk to Putney, and were very smartly dressed. However, I was worried about Traddles' hair. It stood up on end. I asked him very politely if he could do something about it, but he said there was nothing he could do. His hair always stood up on end. We went into the drawing-room,
and I could hear Jip. Oh, joy! Dora was truly nearby. I was very excited. First, the ladies introduced themselves, Miss Lavinia and Miss Clarissa. They were never invited to Dora's house and so did not know her very well. However, they thought she was very young to get married, and they wanted us to go slowly. They said I could see her every Sunday afternoon, and then twice for tea during the week. I was very happy. They said they had to know everything about our meetings. I could not write to her without their knowing about it. I agreed immediately and went upstairs to see my angel. She was dressed in black, but still looked pretty. She didn't want to see Traddles and didn't want to hear about my work. She just wanted to play the guitar and sing. Everything was tra-la-la with Dora. And so I went to the house twice a week to visit Dora. I bought her a cookbook, but Jip ended up sitting on it. I bought her an accounts book, but she drew pictures on it. Her aunts treated her like a child, and I had to do the same. Dora would never grow up. Very soon, Agnes, her father, and Uriah Heep came to visit London and stay with Dr. Strong and his wife. At last my good angel Agnes could meet my dearest girl, Dora. Dora was very frightened at the meeting, worrying that Agnes was too clever for her, but they quickly became the best of friends. I took Agnes home, and as I was leaving, I saw Dr. Strong sitting at his desk. Uriah and Mr. Wickfield were standing over him. I thought Dr. Strong was ill, so I went in. Uriah was talking. "You need to know, sir, I know it's bad news, but we all know that your wife, Mrs. Strong, is too fond of her cousin, Jack Maldon. She goes everywhere with him and is not faithful to you. Your wife is a bad woman, and I'm sure Mr. Wickfield will agree with me." Sadly, Mr. Wickfield did agree. Dr. Strong was overcome with sadness. Uriah was smiling all the time. How I hated him. "It is my fault," said Dr. Strong. "I should not have married someone so young and beautiful. She deserves better. Please do not speak of it again. When I die, she can marry whom she chooses. I am only sad that I found out now." I was so sorry for Dr. Strong and very angry at Uriah. I cried quietly and left. When I went to my room, I found a letter from Mrs. Micawber. It said,
Please, Mr. Copperfield, help me. Mr. Micawber will not talk about his work and doesn't like the children any more. I feel so alone and cannot get him to talk about his secrets. What can I do?
Now that was a puzzle. How quickly time passed. 1 minute Dora and I were walking through snow. The next we were looking at the river and the sunshine. So passed the days, weeks, and months. And then suddenly, it is the day of my marriage. I am 21 and now have work at Parliament writing notes on the speaker's words. I also have a short story printed in a magazine. I found a beautiful little cottage near the city. It's small, but Dora and I will be happy there, I'm sure. Traddles comes to be my best man at the wedding, and we go to meet Agnes and Sophie, his fiancée, from the coach. We travel to the aunt's place in Putney. The last night Dora will spend there. I leave shortly afterwards and walk to my lodgings full of excitement. The next day my aunt, dressed in purple, and Mr. Dick are there. Mr. Dick is to give away the bride. Peggotty is there. She cleaned all our goods until they shone. Miss Spenlow is also there as well. I can't believe what is happening. It's all a dream to me. Dora looks so beautiful and speaks so quietly in the church. We go back to have the wedding breakfast. My aunt makes a speech, and then I do, but I don't remember what I said. Dora goes inside to change her clothes and comes out into my arms. She is covered with flowers and carrying Jip, who, of course, is coming with us. As we get into the coach, she waves her hand, and we drive away together, still in a dream.
"Are you happy now, you foolish boy?"
asks Dora.
"And are you sure you won't look back and feel this was a mistake?"
I laugh. Now I have finished looking back. All these days are gone, and I take up my story again. After the wedding was over, we moved into our little house. It seemed so strange to have Dora with me. I could see her every evening, and I wake up to her every morning. We were very much in love. There was one problem in our marriage, and that was our housekeeping. We always had difficulties with servants. At first, we had a servant named Paragon. She was about 50 and had a very stern face. She liked drinking, and I often found her on the floor of the kitchen out cold. When we sat down to meals, they were either uncooked or burnt, and Paragon never served the meals at the right time. I asked Dora to say something to Paragon, but Dora said she could never do that. I later asked my aunt if she could perhaps help Dora to do the housekeeping.
No, Trot,
Said my aunt.
don't ask me. Don't judge Dora. She is not made for housekeeping. Just love her the way she is.
And that is what I did. We had many servants after Paragon, who disappeared with all our silver teaspoons. But they were all the same. They cheated us and served us badly. One night, Traddles came over for dinner. It was burnt, and our whole house was very crowded with Dora's guitar, Jip's house, Dora's artwork, and my writing desk. Traddles was very polite, but we couldn't even sit down properly for dinner. Later, Dora said to me,
I wish Agnes was my teacher. If I spent a year with Agnes, I'm sure I could look after the house. David, will you call me by a silly name?
What silly name is that? I asked.
Call me your child wife, and then you won't expect me to act like a real wife. I really am just a child.
Although I laughed, I did later think it was a shame I only had a child wife and not a friend. Dora was a lovable girl, very much like a doll, and I had to love her for that and not expect her to be a proper wife. Chapter 12. Bad News Abroad and at Home. I no longer worked for Dr. Strong, but I lived in his neighborhood and stopped by to see him often. Mrs. Strong's mother stayed with them all the time and went out to balls and parties with Mrs. Strong. One day Mr. Dick came to me and said, I know I'm simple, Trot, so can you tell me what is wrong with Dr. Strong and Mrs. Strong? I see them often and they are unhappy. It's difficult. No one can help them. They are sad about their marriage. Perhaps I, who am simple, can do what clever people can't, said Mr. Dick, and he went away. A few weeks later, I called on Dr. Strong with my aunt. The elder Mrs. Strong came in with great excitement and said that Dr. Strong had just made his will and left everything to his wife. Later, Mr. Dick came into the room with Mrs. Strong, who was crying.
My dear husband,
She said, going down on her knees at his feet.
everyone thought I married you for your money, but that's not true. I hear now you have left me your money. Please don't do this. You are too good for me. I have always loved you. Mr. Dick told me that you think I love my cousin, Jack Maldon, but I have never, ever loved him. In fact, I dislike him. Once, when I was young, I thought I loved him, but young love can never grow to something more when two people are so unalike as he and I.
The good doctor lifted her up and held her in his arms. They were happy again, and all because of Mr. Dick. Later, my aunt said to Mr. Dick,
Dick, you did the best thing you've ever done today.
I thought a lot about what was said. Two people who are so unalike as Maldon and Mrs. Strong. Perhaps that was the same as me and my child wife. On my way to and from work, I often passed Mrs. Steerforth's house. One day the maid came out to ask me to come in. She said Miss Dartle wanted to see me. I walked into the garden and saw that angry woman and disliked her as never before.
He has left her. I hope she's dead.
She said triumphantly.
Tell Littimer to come out to tell the story.
She said to the maid. Littimer came out.
"Tell Mr. Copperfield what happened,"
said Miss Dartle. Master James Steerforth and the lady, I knew he meant Emily, left for Europe and traveled through many countries. Their love lasted a long time, and they were very happy. But then the lady often walked down to the sea and spoke to the children there. She was obviously thinking of her own childhood. Master James did not like it. He wanted her to forget her humble beginnings. They argued, and he left her in Italy. He told me to ask her to marry me. Littimer coughed. I did this, and Miss Emily got very angry. She wanted to kill herself. I had to lock her up to save her. I'm sure she would hate the idea of marrying you, I said. There is no need to be rude, said Littimer quietly. Do you know where she is? I asked. I think she's in London. I left them and walked to the rooms where I knew Mr. Peggotty was staying. I told him the story and told him about poor Martha. We thought that if Emily was in London, Martha might have seen her. We went straight to the river to look for Martha. It was our only hope. We saw Martha on a bridge and followed her, thinking she was going to her rooms. She didn't. She went nearer and nearer to the river. She looked sad and upset. She was standing by the water, looking into its dark depths. I came up behind her and grabbed her by the arm. She turned to me, terrified. She kept saying,
"Oh, the river! Oh, the river! It's all I'm fit for. I'm not worth anything else."
I made her recognize me and Mr. Peggotty, and she calmed down. We told her of our belief that Emily was in London, and we asked her to help us find her.
"I will,"
she said.
"Miss Emily was good to me. She gave me money. I don't want her to end up on the streets. I want her to go back to her home with you, Mr. Peggotty."
Thank you very much, I said. Let me give you money for your search. But she wanted no money.
"I'll look for her, Master Davy,"
she said.
"and if I find her, I'll come to Mr. Peggotty's room as quickly as possible."
And there we left her. I walked Mr. Peggotty to his room and went home. When I arrived home, I found my aunt outside her house, which was opposite ours, shouting at a dirty old man in the street. She gave him money and he walked away. I went into her house and asked who the old man was.
"Trot,"
she said.
"I was once married, and that was my husband. He is a dirty old man now and comes back to me for money every so often. I give him all I can, but I'll never be rid of him. Let's not talk about him again."
I agreed. I started work on my book, while at the same time working at the newspaper. Dora and I had been married about 18 months and had just as much trouble with servants as ever. We had a page who stole from us and dropped plates and gave bottles of wine to his friends. Finally, he was caught for theft and was sent to Australia. As the year wore on, Dora was getting weaker. She became weak, and Jip, who was always so full of life, became old.
"How strange that Jip should be old,"
said Dora when he wouldn't jump up to her.
"It happens to us all.
Said my aunt.
We'll get you another dog when Jip goes."
"Oh, no,"
said Dora.
"Only Jip knew me when I was not married. I couldn't be friends with another dog."
When Dora came down to dinner the next Sunday with Traddles, Traddles always dined with us on Sundays. We thought she would get better in a few days. She didn't, but the doctors said, "Wait a few days more." We waited, but she still couldn't get around by herself, and then I always had to carry her upstairs and downstairs. Traddles or Mr. Dick held the candles for her, but we were all happy, my wife being the happiest of us all. But on my own, after my aunt called Dora Dear Blossom, I held my head in my hands and thought what a sad name that was, and how blossoms die on the tree. Chapter 13. Mr. Micawber's Mystery and Emily's Story. I received a letter from Mr. Micawber the very next day. It said,
Dear Sir, I will be coming to town next week, and I shall be standing outside the debtor's prison, where I spent so many happy hours. If you and your good friend Traddles could meet me there, I would be most pleased. Yours, Wilkins Micawber.
Just then, Traddles came in with a letter from Mrs. Micawber. It said the same as her earlier letter to me, that she was very upset with Mr. Micawber. But it also asked us to see Mr. Micawber while he was in town. She didn't want us to tell him anything about her letter, though. We were most confused. What was happening with Mr. Micawber? Why did he want to see us? What could we do to help him? We had to wait until the following Thursday to find out. We met him outside the debtor's prison. He didn't look happy. I invited him to my aunt's house to introduce him to her. As we walked there, I talked of Uriah Heep.
Oh, Heep!
Cried Mr. Micawber, then looked to the ground.
Oh, how miserable I am with Heep.
But he would tell us nothing more. Mr. Dick was wonderful with Mr. Micawber. He seemed to know right away that he was unhappy and shook Mr. Micawber's hands 5 times. My aunt also made him talk, but after half an hour, Mr. Micawber, who was making a mess of the punch, threw the things to the ground and shouted,
I will kill that snake Heep,
and ran out of the house. Shortly afterwards, a page brought a letter from him.
Dear Sirs, I apologize for my actions. I wish to explain everything. Please come down to Canterbury next Thursday, and you will understand everything. I cannot bear this any longer. Truly, Wilkins Micawber.
I was thinking about Mr. Micawber during the following days, but one night Martha came to my house and asked me to come with her. She said it was about Emily. Of course, I got ready quickly, and we took a coach to a poor part of London. She had left a message for Mr. Peggotty, and he said he would meet us there. We didn't speak in the coach, but got out and went up the stairs together. As we were coming to the top step, I saw Miss Dartle going into Martha's room. We stood outside the door and listened, waiting for Mr. Peggotty to arrive.
I wanted to see what kind of lowlife you were,
screamed Miss Dartle.
You are the worst of women to come between a gentleman and his mother. I will make sure everyone knows how bad you are, and I hope you kill yourself.
Then came Emily's voice.
I know I am bad, but that Steerforth tricked me. He said he would marry me. Marry you? You with such poor blood in your body? He lied to me. Don't you think I hate myself already? There's nothing you can do to make me feel worse.
I wanted to go in and stop this, but we had to wait for Mr. Peggotty. It was his dream to save Emily.
I shall leave now, but if you are here tomorrow, I will tell everyone what you are.
With that, Miss Dartle left and pushed past us. Mr. Peggotty came racing up the stairs. He ran inside Martha's room and held Emily in his arms. She fainted. The next morning at my aunt's house, I met with Mr. Peggotty, who told me Emily's story. After Emily left Steerforth, she went to the beach and fell down and fainted. There, a poor fisherman's wife found her and looked after her for many days. She got to know the children there and soon wanted to leave for England. Soon after she arrived in London, Martha found her and contacted us. After telling us this, Mr. Peggotty put his head in his arms. He was very upset, but happy that Emily was back. "What shall you do now?" I asked. "Oh, we'll go to Australia, where no one will know of Emily's shame," said Mr. Peggotty, and he gave me the £60 Emily had sent him. "Please send that back to Mrs. Steerforth, Master Davy." Then he asked me to go with him to Yarmouth, and I agreed. It was lovely to see the old place again, and Mr. Omer, now in a wheelchair, sitting at the front of his house. Mr. Peggotty packed his bags and left Mrs. Gummidge some money to live on. Mr. Peggotty was now living with Ham, and I went to see that unfortunate young man alone.
Oh, Master Davy, tell Emily I'm happy she's back, and I forgive her. I still love her, and I'll love no one else but her for the rest of my days.
I'll tell her, I said to Ham. At Mr. Begotti's old boathouse, I found Mrs. Gummidge very upset.
Tell him, Mr. Copperfield, that I can come with him. I'll help him and Emily, and I'll always look after them. I won't complain. Honest, I won't.
Mr. Begotti said no, but when we got into the carriage the next day, Mrs. Gummidge was sitting in the back. For the first time in her life, she was happy. When that Thursday came to go down and see Mr. Micawber, my aunt wanted to stay with Dora, but Dora told her to go. After some friendly argument, my aunt, Traddles, and I set off for Canterbury. We went into Mr. Wickfield's house and saw Mr. Micawber there. He took us in to see Uriah, whom I hadn't seen since I hit him. Uriah was surprised, but he pretended to be happy.
Mr. Copperfield and Miss Trotwood and Mr. Traddles, Micawber, you can go.
But Mr. Micawber stayed. Uriah told him to go again. Uriah did not notice Traddles leaving the room.
No, sir,
said Mr. Micawber.
Not until I read this letter about Heap.
And he started to read his letter.
I wish to say 3 things about the detestable Heap. First, I have collected all this information while I was a clerk here at Wickfield, and I have found that Heap has cheated Mr. Wickfield. Second, he told Mr. Wickfield, that good man, that he owed money to everyone. Third, that Heap has forged Mr. Wickfield's signature on many documents. In these ways, he has taken over Mr. Wickfield's business, and he is a cheat.
Traddles came back with Mrs. Heap.
Oh, be humble, Uriah, and say sorry,
said Mrs. Heap.
Shut up, Mother, said Uriah. I'll make life black for all of you. I know all about your husband, Miss Trotwood, and I know about your poor childhood, Mr. Copperfield. Micawber, you'll never work again.
Traddles had gotten all the documents, though. We told Uriah to leave the house, and we would not tell the police. Uriah left, and Traddles turned to my aunt.
Miss Trotwood, we can return your money. I have discovered from the documents that we can recover all of your money as well as Mr. Wickfield's. You gave it to Mr. Wickfield, didn't you?
Why, yes,
said my aunt.
I thought he was a bad businessman, but because I liked him, I didn't complain. Am I really going to get everything back?
And so it was. Mr. Micawber took us all back to his place to make friends with his family again. My aunt offered him money because, without his hard work, Uriah would still be doing his evil work. The Micawbers thought of going to Australia, and my aunt said she would help them.
Chapter 14. 4 Deaths.
I must stop this story and look back again at my wife. Oh, my child wife, I see her now, walking through my memory. I am in the little cottage again with Dora. Dora is now very ill, and they have stopped saying, "Wait a few days more." I know that the day will never come when my wife plays with Jip again. 3 memories come back to my mind. It is morning, and Dora is in her bed. She never comes downstairs now. She says,
"Let's go on a walk again and see those old places."
"Yes," I say. "We'll have happy days, so you must get well, my dear."
Oh, I shall soon do that. I am so much better.
Now it is evening, and I sit by the same bed and tell her how I miss her downstairs. Dora asks to see Agnes. She says,
"Sometimes I think I won't get well again, and the only thing I wish for is to see Agnes."
So I send for Agnes. She, my aunt, and I sit all day with my dear girl. Then she asks to speak to Agnes alone. I go downstairs and sit at the fire with old Jip. Jip goes to the door and cries to go upstairs. "No, Jip, it may be never again," I say. He lies down at my feet and dies. Agnes comes in and I tell her that Jip has died. She looks sorrowfully and tells me that Dora has died. It is over. Darkness comes before my eyes, and, for a time, I forget everything. After Dora dies, I decide to travel abroad, but before I could go, I had to say goodbye to the immigrants. My aunt and I decided to visit the Micawbers with Traddles to work out the details.
Well, Mr. Micawber,
Said my aunt.
have you decided about my offer?
Yes, madam, I have. We will borrow money from you and leave you IOUs.
Perhaps my family will help us too.
Said Mrs. Micawber.
Whatever you think is right.
Said my aunt.
And now I wish to talk to Traddles and Trot on my own.
The Micawbers all left the room.
How much of my money have you found, Mr. Traddles?
About 5,000.
Why, that's all of it. I had 8,000 pounds, but I paid 1,000 for Trot's work, and I saved 2,000 of it. I gave Mr. Wickfield the rest. Now, what are we going to give Mr. Micawber? Without him, I would never have got it back.
Traddles and I advised her not to give Mr. Micawber cash, but to let him write up his IOUs to her. Then Traddles talked of Uriah Heep.
He will go to the police and get Mr. Micawber sent to prison for his IOUs.
I'll pay those as it happens.
Said my aunt.
What about Uriah?
He and his mother have gone to London. He's got a bit of money, but not much. But he can make difficulties for you concerning your husband.
My aunt cried a little, but then said through tears,
Don't talk of him.
We invited the Micawbers back and had a celebration. I now come to a dreadful part of my story. It is so bad that I often have nightmares about it. I often saw Mr. Peggotty, but never saw Emily again. However, I thought she should know what Ham said about her, so I wrote a letter to her, and Mr. Peggotty handed it on to her. A few days later, he came with a letter from Emily to Ham. It said,
I thank you and pray for you. Perhaps after I die, I'll meet you again as a little child and love you always.
I decided to take it right away to Ham in Yarmouth, and caught the coach a few hours later. As we traveled, a dreadful storm started up. The rain poured down like sheets of steel. As we neared the coast, I could see the sea rising and falling. I went to an inn and tried to sleep, but couldn't because of the deafening noise. The next morning, a man knocked on my door. "A ship's going down! It's awful!" I rushed outside and down to the beach to see the ship half ruined. One man was holding the mast. Suddenly, I saw Ham on the beach. He was tied to a long piece of rope and was wading into the sea. I tried to get near him, but he shouted, "If my time is come, it's come. I'm going off to help the man on the ship." I saw him swim through rough waves. I saw him go in and out of the water. Finally, there was one last wave which threw him powerfully onto the shore. The crowd on the beach dragged him out. He was dead. Then they brought out the man from the ship. He too was dead. I recognized him. He looked as he did at school when I read him stories, and he fell asleep. It was Steerforth. I remembered Steerforth's last words. "Remember me at my best." And I did. I looked at him and asked them to take Steerforth with me to London. I had the unhappy job of telling his mother. I went to Mrs. Steerforth's house. As soon as the maid saw me, she knew I had bad news. She took me up to see her mistress and Miss Dartle. They were both in Steerforth's old room.
I see from your clothes your wife has died,
said Mrs. Steerforth. "Yes, we must all suffer sadness at some time. I have news of your son," I said.
He's ill?
"Yes, he's ill. I saw him last night at Yarmouth." I made the word dead with my mouth to Miss Dartle. "There was a bad storm there. If he were on a ship, Miss Dartle stopped me.
Your son is now dead, you proud woman.
Please stop, Miss Dartle, I said.
He loved me for a while, and I loved him. I loved him more than you. You let him do anything he wanted. You spoiled him.
Mrs. Steerforth didn't move at all. She sat still and moaned.
Look at this scar he gave me. He was a selfish boy, and you made him selfish. But I loved him. And a curse on you, Mr. Copperfield, for coming here today. Go!
I left them and learned later that Mrs. Steerforth never spoke again, but sat in Steerforth's room, moaning softly. Chapter 15. Going Away and Coming Home. After Ham and Steerforth's deaths, I had to make sure that Mr. Peggotty and Emily never found out. I told Mr. Micawber, and advised him to make sure of this. He was pleased to do it, and said no newspaper would come to Mr. Peggotty's eyes. Peggotty, my aunt, and I went to see the Micawbers, Mr. Peggotty, Mrs. Gummidge, and Emily off on board the huge ship at Gravesend. All the Micawbers were dressed like sailors or farmers. Obviously, they thought they needed new clothes for the new country. Mr. Micawber worked out more sums on a piece of paper and handed out many IOUs to Traddles and my aunt. A sheriff called for Mr. Micawber to take him to prison again, but I paid the debt, and he came out. He was full of joy again and looked forward to life in a new country. The boat was very crowded, and I didn't see Emily, but I did see Martha. Mr. Peggotty was taking her to Australia with them to start a new life there. I told him that Ham wished them well. He was quite upset, and I, twice as upset, knowing that Ham was dead. Then it was time for the ship to leave. We left the ship and stood on the dock, looking up at them. Mr. Peggotty was arm in arm with Emily. She looked beautiful as she leaned her head on Mr. Peggotty's shoulders. I knew he would look after her as long as he could. Night fell, and we watched the ship depart, waving the entire time. I, too, went away from England full of grief. I was sad for 3 deaths, Steerforth's, Ham's, and most importantly, Dora's. Dora was young when she died. She had so much to live for. Perhaps I would have tired of her, as she said, but it was unfair to take her away. I traveled a long way from home through countries I hardly remember. I had bad dreams, but still I traveled. I visited museums, castles, temples, and fantastic streets. I ended up in Switzerland and made my home there. I came one evening before sunset into a valley where I was to rest. As I walked down the valley, I suddenly saw the beauty of the place and felt at peace. I felt sorrow, but not as hard as before, and I almost smiled. I saw green trees and grey rock, and when I came to my hotel, I found letters from home, particularly one from Agnes. She told me that she trusted me to become strong after such sorrow. She said I had shown strength and courage in her life, and now I needed them. I rented a house in Switzerland and started writing again and became friendly with the people who lived there. But all the time I thought of Agnes. I realized that I loved her and always had. Although if she ever had feelings for me, she never showed them except as a sister, and I had never shown her my deep feelings for her. I stayed away 3 long years. My home in England was very dear to me, and Agnes too, but she was not mine. She was never to be mine. She might have been, but that was past. I arrived in London on a winter evening. It was raining and dark. I went to Traddles' rooms in the Inns of Court. I dined at the inn and asked the waiter if he knew Mr. Traddles. He told me where his room was. As I went up the stairs to call on Traddles' rooms, I heard girls' laughter. I knocked, and it stopped. Traddles let me in and was overcome with joy. He introduced me to his darling girl, Sophie. "But you arrived too late, Copperfield. Sophie and I were married 6 weeks ago." I congratulated them, and said I was sorry I missed the wedding. Then Traddles called out to 3 young girls who were hiding. "These are Sophie's darling sisters. They live with us at the court. We are not supposed to have guests, but it is such fun. We laugh and sing all night. And look, Copperfield, here is the table and potholder that we saved from the shop." Traddles was as happy as ever, and we spent a happy night talking and singing. Sophie was the most important person there. Not one of the sisters could do anything without her, and they clearly loved her dearly. I said good night at 11 o'clock and had a drink at the inn. While I was there, I noticed another drinker in the inn, Dr. Chillip, the very man who was there at my birth and whom my aunt hit with her bonnet. He told me about the Murdstones. Mr. Murdstone was married again to a young lady whom he terrorized. She had been happy and carefree before the wedding. Now she was quiet and terrified. We agreed it was a sad situation, but when I talked of the wonderful woman my aunt was, he hurried away. I'm sure he will never forget her. I drove down to my aunt's house and stayed there for the night. The next morning, my aunt and I had a long talk, particularly about Agnes. I wanted to know if she had a lover. My aunt thought she had an affection somewhere, but she knew not with whom. I decided to ride to Canterbury and see Agnes that very day. The old house looked very much the way it was when we grew up, and all the changes from the Heap's time had gone. I found her teaching in her school, which was part of her home. "Agnes, my dear girl, I have come too suddenly upon you."
No. I am so happy to see you, Trotwood.
She said goodbye to her students and sat down, and we were silent for a little while. She told me about her school and how happy she was. Her father had a garden some way off and was there every day, looking after his plants. She was still sweet and calm, but I thought I could see a sadness in her eyes. I agreed to stay for dinner, and we had a lovely meal, herself, her father, and I. Mr. Wickfield was much improved. He didn't drink as much as before, and he talked freely. All his cares were gone. He spoke of Agnes's mother, who died 2 weeks after Agnes was born. I left the Wickfields feeling very sad that I had lost Agnes. I loved her, and if I had spoken earlier, perhaps when we were young, she would have married me. Now it was too late. Chapter 16. Looking Back. I was very famous by now and spent my time working hard on my novels. Many people wrote to me. In fact, I used Traddles' address in London and often went up there from Dover to answer my letters. One day I got a letter from our old principal, Mr. Creakle. He was now a magistrate in Middlesex. He explained how good the prison system was and asked me if I would like to see it. I agreed and invited Traddles to come too. We arrived at the prison to find Mr. Creakle, older and uglier than before, who made a fuss about me, saying I was his best pupil. Mr. Creakle explained the prison system to us. All prisoners were kept alone in their cells and could not speak to other prisoners. They had many prisoners, but one, number 27, was especially good, and Mr. Creakle was especially proud of him. Number 28 was also very good, but not quite as humble as 27. When we went to see number 27, Traddles and I were most surprised to see Uriah Heep. He was reading a hymn book.
"Ah, Mr. Copperfield," he said, "I know you hit me once."
Everyone looked at me horrified.
"But I forgive you. I have learned to be humble here. I just want to write to Mother and make sure she's all right."
Then we went to see prisoner number 28. It was Littimer. Later, I asked the guards what these 2 prisoners had done. 27 tried to steal money from a bank, and number 28 tried to steal £250 from his employer. A dwarf called Miss Moucher stopped him and dragged him down so that the police could get him. I was pleased with Miss Moucher, and knew these 2 prisoners were exactly the same as before. Prison had not changed them a bit. It was near Christmas time, and the days were very cold. I had been back in England for 2 months. I saw Agnes every week, but she never told me who she loved. I needed to know, and asked my aunt about her.
I'm afraid she does love someone, Trot, and I think she will soon get married.
I was very sad. I rode to Canterbury to see Agnes. It was icy cold, and I found Agnes alone. The school was closed for the holidays. I sat beside her and said, "You have a secret, Agnes. Let me share it."
I cannot tell you,
she said as she got up. "I understand you love someone. Are we not close? Can you not tell me?"
I have to leave, Trot. I am not well. I will speak to you soon.
She started crying.
I have long had a secret, and it must remain mine.
"Dearest Agnes, if I have any hope that I may call you something more than sister one day." Still weeping, Agnes now looked happy, not sad.
I have had a secret all my life. I have loved you all my life.
I took Agnes back to my aunt's and told her that we were to be married. She was delighted, and we married within 2 weeks. On the day of our wedding, my darling Agnes told me that Dora had said to her,
Only you can take my place with David.
10 years later, a visitor appeared whose story has been important to this book. Agnes and I were married with 3 young children. We were playing in the front parlor when a servant came to say that a visitor, who looked like a farmer, was at the door asking for us. She showed him in, and it was Mr. Peggotty. He was an old man now, but hearty and strong. "Master Davy, it is a joyful day to see you with your wife and children." Then he told us about the emigrants over in Australia. Emily was doing well. She had had many offers of marriage, but wanted to stay with Mr. Peggotty. They had bought land and were well-to-do farmers. Mrs. Gummidge was a changed person. She never complained and always worked hard. She, too, had an offer of marriage, but said no. Of course, I asked about the Micawbers, and Mr. Peggotty gave me a newspaper cutting about Mr. Micawber. He was now a magistrate and a very respectable person in the land. He gave speeches about poverty and how to overcome it. He had written me a letter, of course, thanking me for my help in getting him and his family to Australia. Mr. Peggotty stayed with us for a month. During that time, he saw his sister, Peggotty, and my aunt, and we travelled together up to Yarmouth to see Ham's grave. He picked up a handful of earth from the grave and put it in his pocket. "For Emily," he said. "I promised." Now this is where my story ends. I look back for the last time on my life. I see Agnes by my side and our children and friends. What faces are around me! My aunt, now over 80, but upright and a good walker. Then Peggotty with her old school books, washing and cleaning for my aunt. And Mr. Dick, who plays with my children, flying kites with them and trying to forget Charles I. There is Mr. Jack Maldon, who has no goodwill toward the good doctor who helped him. Then there is Dr. Strong and his wife Annie. They are such good friends of ours. The good doctor is still working on his dictionary. I think he is up to the letter D. And Traddles and his wife Sophie is now very busy at court. But he and Sophie still look after some of Sophie's sisters. They laugh and sing and play all night. No one could be happier than Traddles. As I close my work, these faces fade away, but one face, shining like a heavenly light, is above and beyond all these faces, and that one remains. I turn my head and see it, in all its loveliness. My lamp burns low, and I have written long into the night, but the dear face, without which I am nothing, stays with me for company. O Agnes, O my soul, may your face be with me when I close my life, and may I always find you pointing upward.
Playlet, David Copperfield.
Go along with you.
You have no business here. How dare you trespass? Go along, oh, you bold-faced thing.
Aunt, that's my step-aunt, Miss Murdstone. She's come to visit you.
I don't care who it is. I won't have trespassers. I won't allow it. Go away. Janet, turn him round. Lead him off. That's it, Janet. Pull the donkey off. Pull.
Let go, young woman. Let go of my sister's horse.
That's it, Janet. Now you can let them in.
Shall I go away, Aunt?
No, certainly not. Oh, I didn't know it was you, but I don't allow anyone to ride over my grounds. I don't like donkeys, and that's it.
We were on horses.
Makes no difference. They're all donkeys to me.
That's rather difficult for strangers.
Is it?
Miss Trotwood.
I beg your pardon. You are Mr. Murdstone, who married the widow of my nephew, David Copperfield.
I am.
I think you should have left the poor child alone.
I agree. Poor Mrs. Copperfield was just a child herself.
No one can say the same of us, Miss Murdstone.
No doubt, and I agree with you that my brother should not have married young Mrs. Copperfield.
Janet? Ask Mr. Dick to come down. Mr. Murdstone and Miss Murdstone, sit down. Mr. Murdstone, Miss Murdstone, this is Mr. Dick, an old and great friend. I take his advice in all matters.
After I read your letter, I decided I should come here in person and talk to you about it.
Thank you.
And he looks so dreadful.
Jane Murdstone, please do not interrupt me. This unhappy boy, Miss Trotwood, has caused a lot of trouble and worry. He was a worry to his mother, too. He has a bad spirit, a violent temper, and will not do what he is told. Both my sister and I have tried to correct him, but without success, and I feel that you should know this.
I can only agree with my brother on all points. I can simply say that of all the boys in the world, this is the worst boy.
Strong words.
But not at all too strong for the facts.
Ha! Well, sir?
I thought very carefully about the best way to bring him up. I did what I thought was right. I have strong thoughts, and I act upon them, and I say not more about them. I sent this boy to work for a friend of mine. This friend owns a good business. Now I find that this work does not please David Copperfield, and that David Copperfield has run away. He comes here in rags to ask you, Miss Trotwood, to look after him. I wish to tell you what will happen if you help him in this way.
About this respectable business. If David had been your own boy, would you have put him to it just the same?
If he had been my brother's boy, he would have been completely different.
And if the poor child's mother, Clara, had been alive, would he still have gone into that good business?
I believe Clara would have agreed with me and my sister. David would have gone. It was for the best.
Unfortunate baby. And Clara left no money for the boy?
Nothing.
Not the house or garden?
Nothing.
So when you married the poor girl, Clara, no one said anything about the boy? And she left everything to you?
That is correct. My late wife loved me, ma'am, and trusted me completely.
Your late wife was the most unhappy, most unfortunate baby. That's what she was. Now, what have you got to say next?
Only this. I am here to take David back. I will deal with him as I think proper. I am not here to make promises to anybody. You may believe his complaints. Your manner makes me think so, but I must warn you that if you help him, you must take complete responsibility for him. Is he ready to go with us? If not, then I will never take him in again. My doors will be shut forever.
Well, ma'am, have you got anything to say?
Nothing at all except my thanks for your politeness.
And what does the boy say? Are you ready to go, David?
Oh, no, Aunt, please, no. Neither Mr. Murdstone nor his sister have ever liked me. They made my mother unhappy about me, and Peggotty knows that well enough. I have been more miserable than anyone can believe. Please look after me and protect me, for my father's sake.
Mr. Dick, what shall I do with this child?
Get him measured for a suit immediately.
Mr. Dick, give me your hand, for you are right. You can go when you like. I'll take my chance with the boy. If he's all you say he is, at least I can help him as much as you have, but I don't believe a word of it.
Miss Trotwood, if you were a gentleman—
Bah, don't talk to me. Do you think I don't know, Mr. Murdstone, how you made Clara suffer? How you made her fall in love with you with soft words, and telling her you'd make a happy family with the boy?
What are you saying?
I can see right through you. Your fine ways and your politeness. I'm sure you were made of sweetness before you were married, but afterwards you bullied her like a caged animal.
I never heard anything like this. You are either mad or drunk.
Mr. Murdstone, you were an animal to that poor baby. She was a poor, simple, loving child before she met you. You ruined her. This is the truth. Good day, sir, and goodbye. Good day to you too, ma'am. Let me see you ride a donkey over my green again, and as sure as you have a head upon your shoulders, I'll knock your bonnet off and tread upon it.
Oh, thank you, Aunt, thank you.
Mr. Dick, you and I will look after this child.
Ha ha ha! Certainly, Miss Trotwood.
Very good. I've been thinking, do you know, Mr. Dick, I might call him Trotwood.
Certainly, certainly. Call him Trotwood.
Welcome to our home, Trotwood Copperfield.
Silence! cried Mr. Mell. Silence yourself, said Steerforth. You should not be rude to a gentleman, said Mr. Mell. Where's the gentleman? asked Steerforth. The students were silent. It looked as if Steerforth was going to hit Mr. Mell, but suddenly Mr. Creakle and Mr. Toongay came back. They wanted to know what was going on. Mr. Mell is not a gentleman, Mr. Creakle, said Steerforth. He has a mother in the poorhouse. I felt awful. I had told Steerforth about our visit to Mr. Mell's relative, whom I thought was his mother. Now Steerforth was using it against him.
Then Steerforth is right,
said Mr. Creakle.
If your mother is in the poorhouse, you cannot work here any longer.
Then I shall go now, said Mr. Mell, and he looked down kindly at me. I shall not stay where I am not wanted. Afterwards I was sad, but I had visitors and forgot about Mr. Mell. It was Ham and Mr. Peggotty. I introduced them to Steerforth, who was very polite and easy to talk to. They liked him immediately. The holidays soon arrived, and I was getting ready to go back to see my dear mother and Peggotty. I got into the coach, and Mr. Barkis was waiting for me.
Did you send that message to Peggotty?
He asked. Yes, Mr. Barkis. I said, Barkis is willing.
There wasn't an answer,
he replied.
When a man says he's willing, he expects an answer.
I'll ask her as soon as I see her, I promised. As soon as I got off the coach, I went inside our house and ran up to see my mother. Mother had a little baby with her.
This is your baby brother, Davy,
she said. I was very happy. I held the little baby in my arms and felt at home. Mr. and Miss Murdstone were out. Peggotty came in. Mr. Barkis says he wants an answer, Peggotty. Peggotty laughed and threw her apron over her head.
He wants to marry me, but I'll not leave you, Davy, nor you, Mrs. Copperfield.
The three of us read books and talked until the Murdstones came home. Then I quickly went upstairs to bed. If only there were no Murdstones, I thought. The following days were awful. One day I was sitting in the parlor, holding the baby, when Miss Murdstone gasped,
Clara, you mustn't let the boy hold the baby. Put the baby down this minute.
I was so frightened I almost dropped the poor thing. I started staying in the kitchen with Peggotty or going outside, but Mr. Murdstone soon stopped that.
"You must always stay within my sight," said Mr. Murdstone. "And you, Clara, must not let him talk to your servant." After that I was stuck inside with the Murdstones. I had nothing to do, and I couldn't move. I just sat and sat for hours and hours. When the holidays ended, I was sorry to see the last of my mother, but I was happy to be leaving that unhappy home. She stood outside our house with the baby in her arms, waving to me. Chapter 3. The End of My School Days. I will never forget my birthday at Salem House. Mr. Creakle sent for me and told me my mother was dead. His wife, Mrs. Creakle, let me stay in their parlor all afternoon. I felt empty and sad. When I went to bed, Traddles, my friend, lent me his pillow. I left Salem House the next day to go home. A man in black came to collect me from the coach. He introduced himself as Mr. Omer and took me to his house. It had a sign up outside, Omer Tailors and Funerals. I went inside where his 3 daughters sat sewing. They talked and sewed, but I just sat there thinking quietly. "I remember your father," said Mr. Omer. "We buried him near your house." We stopped at a coach house, and I went into the dining room. I had 3 shillings with me and asked for some food. The waiter served me, but he helped me eat all my food. I was still hungry, but I didn't say anything. I asked him for some paper, which he brought. "Paper costs money," he said. So I gave him a shilling. I wrote to Bugatti and told her that Barkis was willing. Then I got back on the coach to London. It took a long time, but finally the coach stopped and I got out. Mr. Mell, a teacher from the school, was waiting for me. He was a thin, sad man. He and I walked to the school. We stopped on the way for breakfast at an old woman's house. Mr. Mell played the flute, but it was a very sad song. We got to the school, but there was no one there. "It's holidays. Only really bad boys stay at the school when it's holidays," explained Mr. Mell. We went into the dormitory. I saw a sign that said, "Take care of him. He bites." I looked around. Where was the dangerous boy, or perhaps a dog? No one else was around. I looked at Mr. Mell. He shook his head. "The sign is for you, David. You must wear it." I put it on. I was 8 years old and felt so alone. After about a month of this, the principal and all the boys came back to Salem House. The principal's name was Mr. Creakle, and he was a horrible man. He asked for me as soon as he came home. A man with a wooden leg took me into his part of the school, which was a lot better than where the rest of us lived. With my sign around my neck, I looked at Mr. Creakle and his wife. "So," he said, "you bite, do you? Well, let's see if you can bite this." He spoke very quietly, and the man with the wooden leg repeated his words after him. He took me by the ear and pinched it hard. "You may go. Take him away," said Mr. Creakle. I asked Mr. Creakle if I could take the sign off from around my neck. He jumped out of his chair and chased me out of the room. I ran to the dormitory and lay shaking for hours. The first boy to come back the next day was a student named Traddles. He told me that Mr. Sharp, another teacher, wore a wig. Traddles became a great friend. He introduced me to all the other boys. Although there were a few who danced around me like I was a wild dog, most of the boys felt sorry for me and my sign. Then I met Steerforth, one of the oldest boys in the school. He asked me if I had any money, and I told him I had 7 shillings from Bugatti. He took the money and bought wine and cakes and biscuits, and we all sat in the dormitory eating and drinking all night long. It was the best time I had had since arriving at the school. "Good night, Copperfield," said Steerforth when we finally went to sleep. "I'll take care of you." Mr. Creakle, the principal, and Mr. Tungay, the head teacher, came in every morning. My teacher was Mr. Tungay. Every morning they came in and Mr. Creakle would say very quietly, "Cut that boy, Mr. Tunge." And Mr. Tunge would hit the poor boy with a cane. Mr. Tunge gave the cane to boys for being quiet or for saying something. He gave the cane to boys who looked at Mr. Creakle and boys who didn't. It was a miserable life, but Mr. Tunge seemed to enjoy himself. About this time, Steerforth asked me to tell him the stories from the storybooks I had read when I was at home with Mother. So every night I tried to remember the stories as well as I could and stayed up late telling them to Steerforth. I was often very sleepy. Mr. Mell was the only likable teacher. He quietly helped me to learn, and I liked him a lot. Unfortunately, Steerforth did not like him. He did everything to make his life miserable. One day, Mr. Creakle and Mr. Tunge had business in town and left Mr. Mell to look after the students. The children started to shout and play at their desks, and Mr. Mell could do nothing. It was still exciting. Finally, we arrived at the beach.
"Look,"
she said.
"there's our house, Master Davy."
I looked, but all I could see was an upside-down boat with a chimney. It was their house. We went inside, and it was beautifully clean. I met Mr. Ham Peggotty, Peggotty's brother, a little boy called Ham, and a little girl called Emily, whom I thought was very beautiful. "Is this your daughter, Mr. Peggotty?" I asked.
"No, she's my niece. And that boy, Ham, is my nephew, my brother's son. I have no children."
"So where are their fathers?" Mr. Peggotty looked serious and said, "Drowned." I felt sad, and Peggotty said I should get to bed. We stayed at the boathouse for 2 weeks. During that time, I played with Emily a lot. We went down to the beach, and I felt close to her. She had no father, just like me. There was one other person in the boathouse, a Mrs. Gummidge. She was old and often said,
"Oh, I'm all alone, and no one cares for me."
I kept out of her way. After 2 weeks, Peggotty and I said goodbye to Peggotty's family. I was glad to be home, but was upset when Mother didn't come out to meet me. "Oh, Peggotty, is she dead?"
"No, no, Master Davy. You should know that you have a new father."
My heart felt cold. We went inside. Mother and Mr. Murdstone were sitting in the parlor. Mother got up to greet me, but she seemed timid. "Now, Clara, my dear, don't fuss over the boy," said Mr. Murdstone. "Davy, you have a new bedroom. Go there." I went upstairs and cried myself to sleep. In the morning, Mother came to see me and kissed me, but right after came Mr. Murdstone. "Now, Clara, leave him alone. Go away, and I will talk to the boy." Mother left. "David, if I want to train a bad dog, what do I do?" "I don't know," I said. "I hit him. Now wash your face and be a good boy." I thought things were bad, but they got worse. The next day, Mr. Murdstone's sister arrived. She was just like him, tall and dark and hard. She took the keys to the house from my mother. Mother tried to fight her, but she was too weak. Every night the Murdstones watched me as my mother asked me to recite a book from memory. I tried to remember. Before I went into the parlor, I knew everything perfectly, but once I started to speak, I said the wrong words. Mr. Murdstone looked at me and said to my mother, "Clara, make him do it again." I tried again, but made more mistakes. Miss Murdstone tapped her foot. They looked at me angrily.
"Try again, Davy,"
said my mother. "Don't help him," said Mr. Murdstone. "He's just lazy." "Please, sir, I'm not," I said. Every night it was the same. Finally, Mr. Murdstone brought in a whip. I was frightened. I looked at Mother, and she was frightened for me. "Now, Davy, recite your book." I couldn't. I saw the whip in Mr. Murdstone's hand. "Well, Clara, I see I'll have to teach him a lesson." He moved toward me and caught me. His arm went around my small body. Immediately, I bit him. It was so sudden, Mr. Murdstone carried me to my room and threw me on the bed. I lay there crying and crying. He left me alone. 5 days later, I went away from Mother, away from Bugatti, and away from my lovely home. I was on my way to boarding school. Chapter 2. School Days. I got into the carriage and started to cry. The old coachman, whose name was Barkis, told me to dry my tears. He asked me about Bugatti and whether she was a good cook. I said that she was, and he said,
"Tell her that Barkis is willing."
Mr. Omer and I talked of father for a while, and then he told me that my baby brother had died a few days before mother. Everyone left me for a while. Mr. Omer and his daughters had something to eat and invited me to join them, but I couldn't. Then Mr. Omer took me to my house, and I fell into Bugatti's arms. Dear Bugatti, she hadn't slept but stayed awake sitting beside Mother in the bedroom. I saw Mr. Murdstone. He was sitting in an armchair crying. His sister wasn't crying, though. Bugatti took me to my room and told me about Mother being sick.
She knew she was going, Master Davy. She wanted her baby to be buried with her. And she wanted me to tell you that she blessed you 1,000 times.
I went into the parlor and thought about my mother. I forgot about the frightened woman of the past year and could only remember my mother as a pretty young thing who danced with me in the parlor when I was a little boy. The first thing Mr. Murdstone did was to tell Bugatti to leave. She then asked the Murdstones if I could go with her for a short while to Yarmouth to stay with Mr. Bugatti and Ham. Mr. Murdstone agreed. We traveled to Yarmouth with Mr. Barkis. He asked Bugatti to marry him again, and she spoke to me.
Will you be happy if I marry, Davy?
Oh, yes, Bugatti, I said. Then Mr. Barkis can bring you to visit me. She said I had good sense and told Mr. Barkis she would. I was very happy at Yarmouth, especially with Emily. She had grown so beautiful, but she wouldn't let me kiss her. She just laughed and ran away. Mr. Bugatti and Ham talked of Steerforth, and I told them what a wonderful man he was. A few weeks later, Miss Bugatti married Mr. Barkis, and they moved into a little cottage of Barkis's. Finally came the day I had to return to the Murdstones. I was very sad to leave Yarmouth and go back where I wasn't wanted. Bugatti said she would visit me every week, and she did. I did nothing during the week. There was nothing to do. I had no lessons. I had no friends. Mr. Murdstone just looked angrily at me every time he saw me, and Miss Murdstone told me to get out of the way. One day a friend of Mr. Murdstone's came to stay. His name was Mr. Queenian, and he had a bottle factory in London and offered me a job.
"I'm sending you to do something useful,"
said Mr. Murdstone. The next day, neither sad nor happy, I left my little home on my way to the big world outside. I am not easily surprised nowadays, but it made me think about how I was sent away from school at the age of 10 to work. I started my work at the factory of Murdstone and Grinby. I worked with 3 other boys cleaning wine bottles from 8 in the morning to 8 at night with rats and dirt all around me. On that first day, I met a man called Mr. Micawber. He became my landlord. Mr. Murdstone was paying him my rent. Mr. Micawber was a large, well-dressed gentleman. He collected me from work and took me through the back streets to his house. He introduced me to his wife and their 4 children, twins who were still nursing, a 4-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl. They were very poor and had many creditors. The creditors used to come knocking on the door very early, and they shouted at Mr. Micawber to come out. He never did. He used to say, "If you earn 20 shillings a year and spend 19, you will be happy. If you earn 20 shillings a year and spend 21, you will be unhappy." But he never followed these words. One day the creditors took all their furniture and put the Micawbers in debtor's prison. I liked the Micawbers a lot. Although they were poor and had money worries, they often laughed and joked. I went to visit them in prison often. Apart from my friendship with them, my life was miserable. After the Micawbers got out of prison, they were off to Plymouth, where Mr. Micawber believed something would turn up. Chapter 1. My Early Childhood. To begin at the beginning, I was born on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. My mother's nurse believed that I was going to be unlucky because midnight was unlucky. I was born at Blunderstone in Suffolk, England, 6 months after my father died. There was only my mother and me in our family. Well, there was an aunt of my father's called Betsy Trotwood. She was very unhappy in her marriage, and her husband left her and went to India, so she lived all alone by the sea. However, I never saw her while I was growing up. Now, on that Friday night when I was born, my mother was sitting by the fire, feeling very sick and sad. Suddenly, she saw a strange woman coming up the garden path. Mother was immediately frightened of this woman, who stood so straight and tall. This woman walked quickly to the window and looked inside. It was Betsy Trotwood. My mother got up and stood behind a chair as Miss Betsy came in.
"You must be Mrs. Copperfield,"
said the aunt.
"Yes,"
said my mother.
"I have come to see your baby girl."
Said Miss Betsy.
"Ask your servant to come in." "It might not be a girl,"
said my mother.
"Nonsense,"
said Miss Betsy.
"Peggotty?"
called my mother. Bigotti was our servant. She looked after us. She came to my mother right away.
"Get the doctor,"
said Miss Betsy to Bigotti.
"Mrs. Copperfield needs help."
Soon afterwards, our doctor arrived. He was a kind old man and was surprised to see Miss Betsy there. He took Mother upstairs, and my aunt sat downstairs. My aunt waited. After an hour or two, the doctor came back down to see her. "It's going slowly. Mrs. Copperfield is not very strong." He went back upstairs, and again Miss Betsy waited for a girl. At midnight he came downstairs and said, "Mrs. Copperfield is safe and well. She has a beautiful baby boy." At this my aunt stood up and hit him with her bonnet. She didn't say a word and left the house. She never came back, just like the bad fairy. While I was a young child, I lived with the two people I loved most, my mother and our servant, Bigotti. We lived in a beautiful old house with a large garden, and Bigotti looked after us. She cooked and cleaned and read me stories. I loved her dark kitchen. She worked very hard, and we lived a wonderful life. One night I was sitting with her while she was reading a children's book to me. "Are you married, Bigotti?"
"Goodness, no,"
said Bigotti.
"Don't you want a husband? You're very pretty."
"Goodness, no, Davy. I've never had a husband, and I don't want one. What would your mother do without me?"
Then she took me up to bed. The next day my mother came home with a strange man. He was tall and dark. Mother said,
"This is Mr. Murdstone, Davy. Shake hands."
I didn't like the man. He didn't smile, and he said, "You shouldn't kiss David so much, Mrs. Copperfield." Then to me he said, "Let's be best friends, David. Shake hands." I gave him my left hand. "That's the wrong hand," laughed Mr. Murdstone. Later I found Mother and Bigotti crying. Bigotti was saying,
"Mr. Copperfield wouldn't like this one, miss."
I didn't understand. A few days later, Bigotti asked me if I wanted to go to Yarmouth to see her brother.
"Oh, yes, please, Bigotti,"
I replied. So Bigotti and I set off the next day for her brother's place in Yarmouth. The horse was slow, so the journey felt very long. Then Bigotti fell asleep, but she brought lots of food, so our trip